My name is Chelsea, and I am 30 years old. On the night of my 5th wedding anniversary, I expected a quiet dinner at home with my husband. Instead, I got a front row seat to his spectacular self-destruction. The roasted salmon was still warm on our dining table, and the expensive candles were flickering between us when Bradley tossed a thick stack of legal documents right next to my wine glass. They were divorce papers. He sat back in his chair, swirling his red wine with a smug, practiced smile that told me he had been rehearsing this exact moment for weeks. "Accept my mistress, or we break up right now." The words left his mouth so casually, as if he were asking me to pass the salt. I stared at him, letting the silence stretch across the upscale dining room we had supposedly built together. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a partner who completely underestimated your worth. Bradley was 32, the fiercely ambitious chief executive officer of a tech startup that he believed was destined to change the world. To him, I was just Chelsea, the mid-level accountant who worked from home in sweatpants crunching numbers for boring corporate clients. He thought he held all the cards. He thought he knew exactly who I was. He had no idea he was playing a very dangerous game with the person who held his entire future in her hands. I looked down at the papers, then back up at his arrogant face. "Your mistress," I repeated, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "Yes," Bradley said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the mahogany table. "Vanessa is moving in by the end of the week. She is 25, she is my assistant, and more importantly, she is pregnant with my heir." The sheer audacity of the word heir almost made me laugh. We lived in a nice house in the suburbs, not a medieval kingdom. But Bradley had let his ego inflate to astronomical proportions over the last year, right alongside his startup's bloated valuation. "You want your pregnant assistant to move into our home?" I clarified, making sure I laid out his ridiculous demands plainly. "And what exactly is my role in this twisted new arrangement?" Bradley scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "You stay here, you keep quiet, and you help out. Think of it as an upgrade to your current lifestyle. Let us be brutally honest, Chelsea. Look at you. You are 30, you work a dead-end accounting job making a pathetic salary, and you have absolutely no ambition. You crunch numbers for regional suppliers while I am out securing multi-million-dollar investments. I am giving you a chance to stay under my roof and enjoy the lifestyle my success is about to bring us. If you refuse, I will push these papers through. I will divorce you, and I will make sure you leave this marriage with absolutely nothing. You will be back to renting a cramped studio apartment by next month." He really believed his own delusion. He expected me to shatter into a million pieces. He waited for the tears, the begging, the desperate pleas for him to stay and love me. That was the dynamic he had tried to establish since the day we met. He was the visionary tech genius, and I was the lucky plain girl he had taken pity on. He loved feeling superior. Whenever I talked about my work, he would patronizingly pat my hand and tell me not to stress my pretty little head over boring spreadsheets. He never bothered to look closely at those spreadsheets. If he had, he might have noticed they belonged to Apex Holdings, the venture capital giant, where I was not an accountant, but the anonymous founder and chairwoman. I remained perfectly still, watching the man I had married 5 years ago. The charming, driven guy who once brought me coffee in bed had been completely swallowed by this arrogant stranger. "So let me get this straight," I said, maintaining my composure. "You have been sleeping with Vanessa behind my back. Now she is pregnant, and instead of moving out to be with her, you want to bring her here to the house I owned before we even got married and force me to play the supportive roommate. Or else you will ruin me financially." He smiled, a cold and calculating expression. "Exactly. You finally understand how the real world works. I am about to secure $50 million in funding this week. My company is going to the moon. Vanessa understands my vision. She caters to my needs. She does not nag me about coming home late, and she is giving me a child. You, on the other hand, bring nothing to the table but a mediocre paycheck. I am offering you a generous compromise. You get to keep living in luxury, and I get the family I actually want. Do not make this difficult, Chelsea. You do not have the resources to fight me in court. My lawyers will bury you. I looked around our beautifully decorated dining room. I had picked out the artwork, chosen the paint colors, and paid the mortgage every single month. Bradley contributed to the household expenses whenever he felt like it, always claiming his startup needed the capital more than we did. I had allowed him to believe he was the primary provider because it fed his ego and kept my true identity hidden. I wanted a marriage built on love, not money. Clearly, that was a mistake. You think you hold all the power here, I said, my voice completely devoid of the panic he was so desperately hoping to see. I know I do. Bradley fired back, his tone dripping with condescension. You need me, Chelsea. Without me, you are a nobody. You are just a boring bean counter who peaked in her 20s. Vanessa is young, vibrant, and she treats me like the industry leader I am. You should be thanking me for not kicking you to the curb tonight. Now be a good girl, accept the new arrangement, and go prepare the guest room for Vanessa. She has had a stressful first trimester, and I want her comfortable. He leaned back, taking another arrogant sip of his wine, victorious in his own mind. He had laid out his trap perfectly. The divorce papers sat between us like a loaded gun, and he was daring me to pull the trigger. He thought I was trapped by my own mediocrity. He thought the threat of financial ruin would force me into submission. I listened to him detail exactly how our new life would work. Vanessa would get the master suite because of her pregnancy. I would move to the smaller guest bedroom down the hall. I would be expected to handle the cooking and cleaning because Vanessa needed to avoid stress for the sake of the baby. Bradley painted a picture of absolute domestic servitude, framing it as a generous favor to me. The more he spoke, the clearer the reality became. This man did not just want a divorce. He wanted to break me. He wanted to strip away my dignity and keep me around as a monument to his own power. He expected me to shatter, to cry, to beg him to reconsider. He waited for the tears to fall, eager to savor his complete control over my life. I stared at the thick stack of legal documents. I read the bold print on the first page, noting the name of the expensive law firm he had hired using God knows what money. He was right about one thing. This dinner was a turning point. But the person whose life was about to be completely ruined was not the plain, unambitious accountant sitting across from him. I reached across the table, my hand moving steadily past the flickering candles. I did not reach for my wine glass to throw it in his face. I did not reach for a napkin to wipe away non-existent tears. I reached for the silver pen resting right next to the divorce papers. I uncapped the silver pen with a soft click. The metallic sound echoed through the quiet dining room, cutting straight through the heavy, suffocating tension Bradley had tried so hard to build. Without a single tremble in my fingers, I flipped directly to the last page of the thick legal stack. I did not bother reading the predatory clauses, the division of assets, or the insulting alimony terms his cheap lawyers had drafted. I already knew what the papers said, and none of it mattered to me. I pressed the tip of the pen to the paper and signed my name in fluid, decisive strokes. Bradley stopped breathing. The smug, satisfied smile that had been plastered on his face for the last 10 minutes completely vanished. It was wiped away in a fraction of a second, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He blinked rapidly, staring blindly at the fresh, dark ink on the signature line. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. "Wait," he stammered, his voice suddenly pitching an octave higher. "What are you doing?" "I am giving you exactly what you asked for," I replied calmly, placing the silver pen back onto the polished mahogany table. "I am signing the divorce papers. You said you wanted to build a family with your assistant. You said I brought absolutely nothing to the table. I am simply getting out of your way, Bradley." He lunged forward, his dining chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. He reached out to snatch the documents away from me, but I casually slid them across the smooth surface, keeping them safely out of his reach. My swift movement snapped him out of his initial shock, sending him into a full-blown panic. "No, you misunderstood me," Bradley pleaded. His hands were actually shaking now. The confident tech executive persona had completely shattered, leaving behind a desperate, sweating mess. "Chelsea, wait a minute. Let us not be hasty here. I was just making a point. I was angry. We do not need to finalize anything tonight. Please just slide those papers back to me." I watched him squirm, thoroughly enjoying the pathetic display. I knew exactly why he was sweating, and it had absolutely nothing to do with saving our marriage or preserving our vows. Bradley had a massive secret, one he thought he had hidden perfectly behind his corporate jargon and his late-night networking meetings. His startup was bleeding cash at an alarming rate. He was desperate for capital just to keep the lights on and pay his developers. He was currently begging for a $50 million lifeline from my firm Apex Holdings. But venture capital firms do not just hand over massive checks without extreme due diligence, collateral, and personal guarantees. Bradley was planning to use this very house as his ultimate safety net. The beautiful sprawling house in the suburbs that I had bought and paid off entirely with my own money long before I ever put on a wedding ring. He needed me to remain his legally bound wife, living obediently under this roof, so he could quietly leverage my premarital asset to secure his high-risk business loans. He threw these divorce papers on the table as a scare tactic, a twisted psychological game to force me into submission, so I would obediently co-sign whatever financial documents he shoved in front of me next week. He never anticipated that I would call his bluff and legally sever our ties, ending his access to my assets in one fell swoop. A sudden divorce would trigger a hard audit of his personal finances. It would expose his total lack of equity. It would destroy his carefully curated image of stability just days before his final pitch to the Apex Holdings board. "You clearly laid out the terms, Bradley," I said, ignoring his outstretched hand and keeping my voice perfectly level. "Accept the Mistress or break up." I chose the latter. "I think it is the best possible decision for both of our futures." He was hyperventilating now, gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. "Chelsea, please listen to me. I have major investor meetings this week. This is terrible timing for legal changes. We can work this out. We can go to counseling. You are overreacting to a bad joke." Before he could spin another pathetic lie, the sound of a key turning in the front door echoed down the hallway. Bradley froze. The blood that had started to return to his face instantly vanished again. Heavy, aggressive footsteps clicked against the entryway tile, followed by the distinct rhythmic sound of expensive luggage wheels rolling into our foyer. "Brad, babe, are you in here?" The voice was loud, nasal, and dripping with unearned entitlement. Vanessa had arrived. She strolled right into the dining room, pulling a massive designer suitcase behind her with zero hesitation. She was 25, wearing a tight dress that barely concealed her supposedly pregnant belly, and carrying a luxury handbag that cost more than her annual salary as an administrative assistant. A handbag I immediately recognized as one purchased with stolen company funds from his startup. She stopped at the edge of the dining room, taking in the entire scene. She looked at the lit candles, the untouched roasted salmon, and finally at me sitting calmly at the table. Instead of showing any shame or hesitation, Vanessa rolled her eyes and sighed dramatically, acting like I was a stubborn stain on the rug. "Did you tell her yet, Bradley?" she whined, dropping the handle of her suitcase with a loud thud. "I am exhausted. My back is killing me and the baby has been kicking all day. I need the master bedroom cleared out by tonight. I absolutely cannot sleep on that terrible cheap mattress in the guest room." Bradley looked like he was going to pass out. "Vanessa," he hissed through clenched teeth, casting a terrified glance in my direction. "Not now. I told you to wait at the apartment until I called you." "Why should I wait?" she fired back, planting a hand on her hip and glaring at him. "You said you were giving her the ultimatum tonight. You promised I was moving in as the lady of the house right away. I am carrying your heir, Brad. She needs to pack her bags and get out so I can start nesting." I sat back in my chair, watching the two of them turn on each other. Vanessa glared at me with absolute contempt, completely unaware that she was insulting the woman who controlled the $50 million investment she was banking her entire future on. "You heard him," Vanessa snapped, pointing a sharp manicured finger right at my face. "The marriage is over. Bradley is going to be a multi-millionaire by next week, and we are starting our family. So go grab some garbage bags and start packing your cheap clothes. I want your side of the closet empty before I go to sleep." I looked at Bradley, who was desperately trying to silence his mistress without raising his voice. He looked back at me, his eyes wide with a silent, pathetic plea for mercy. He wanted me to play along to save his precious collateral to endure the ultimate disrespect in my own home, just to keep his fragile house of cards from collapsing. I picked up my wine glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip as the two of them stared at me. "You are right, Vanessa," I said, setting the glass down gently. "The marriage is completely over. But nobody is packing my bags tonight." The heavy silence that followed her arrogant demand was instantly shattered by the sharp chime of our front doorbell. Bradley jumped as if he had been physically struck by an invisible force. Vanessa let out a loud, annoyed groan, crossing her arms over her chest and muttering about late-night deliveries. She told Bradley to go handle it so she could finally take off her heels, but Bradley did not move. He was staring at me, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. I stood up from the dining table, smoothing out the skirt of my dress. I walked past the untouched dinner, past my frozen husband, and past his glaring mistress. I opened the heavy wooden front door, pulling it wide to reveal the stormy night outside. The rain was coming down in thick sheets, hammering against the porch steps. Cutting through the darkness were the bright, flashing red and blue lights of two local police cruisers parked right at the edge of my driveway. Standing on my welcome mat, perfectly shielded by a large black umbrella, was my proxy real estate attorney, Mr. Caldwell. Flanking him were two broad-shouldered police officers in dark rain jackets. Their expressions were stern and completely uncompromising. "Good evening, Chelsea," Mr. Caldwell said, his voice projecting clearly over the sound of the pouring rain. "I have the documents you requested." I stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter our brightly lit foyer. The moment the police officers stepped onto the hardwood floor, Bradley snapped out of his trance. He rushed out of the dining room with Vanessa trailing close behind him. His eyes darted wildly from the officers to the attorney, and then finally to me. "What is going on here?" Bradley demanded, trying to project the authority of a tech chief executive officer. "Why are the police in my house?" "This is not your house," Mr. Caldwell corrected smoothly. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp white folder. He handed a legally binding emergency eviction notice directly to Bradley. "The property deed is solely in my client's name. It was purchased entirely with her independent funds prior to your marriage. Furthermore, due to your hostile behavior and your attempt to move an unauthorized tenant into the premises, my client has exercised her legal right to revoke your residency, effective immediately." Bradley stared at the paper as if it were written in a foreign language. His hands shook so violently that the paper rattled. "You cannot do this," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I am her husband. I have marital rights. I live here." One of the police officers stepped forward, resting his thumbs casually on his duty belt. "Sir, you have been legally served with an emergency eviction order. You and your guest have exactly 15 minutes to gather your basic personal belongings and vacate the premises. If you refuse to comply, we will remove you by force for trespassing." Vanessa let out a piercing shriek. She pushed past Bradley, pointing her manicured finger at the officers. "Are you insane?" she screamed. "I am pregnant. You cannot throw a pregnant woman out into a storm. My baby needs a safe environment. We are about to be multimillionaires next week. Do you know who he is?" The officer did not even blink. "I do not care who he is, ma'am. You have 14 minutes left. I suggest you start packing." Bradley turned to me, his eyes wide with a pathetic mixture of rage and utter terror. "Chelsea, please," he begged, stepping toward me. The officer immediately put a hand up, blocking his path. "Do not do this. You are ruining my life. My investors will find out about this. My company needs this address for the bank loans. If you kick me out tonight, everything collapses. I will lose the $50 million funding." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no sadness, no regret. "You should have thought about your funding before you brought your pregnant assistant into my home and ordered me to serve her," I replied, my voice ice cold. 13 minutes, Bradley. The realization that I was not going to cave finally hit him. The panic took over completely. He scrambled up the stairs, taking them two at a time, slipping in his expensive leather shoes. Vanessa shrieked again and awkwardly waddled after him, dragging her heavy luxury suitcase, bumping up the steps. The police officers followed them closely, making sure they did not attempt to damage any property or steal anything that did not belong to them. I stood in the foyer listening to the chaotic sounds echoing from the second floor. I heard drawers being ripped open. I heard hangers clattering to the floor. I heard Vanessa crying loudly about how her designer shoes were going to get ruined in the rain. At one point, Bradley tried to grab a valuable abstract painting off the hallway wall, claiming he had picked it out. I heard the officer firmly instruct him to put it back and stick to personal clothing. Exactly 15 minutes later, they were marched back down the stairs. Bradley was carrying a duffel bag and a plastic trash bag stuffed with his suits. Vanessa was struggling to pull her massive suitcase, her face smeared with ruined mascara. They looked absolutely pathetic. The glamorous, arrogant couple who had tried to humiliate me just half an hour ago were now being herded like common criminals. As they reached the front door, Bradley turned to look at me one last time. The rain was blowing onto the porch, soaking the shoulders of his shirt. His face was twisted into an ugly mask of pure hatred. "You are going to pay for this, Chelsea." He spat, his voice shaking with venom. "I am going to build my empire and I am going to crush you. You will be begging me for a dime when I am done with you." I leaned against the doorframe, perfectly dry and completely unbothered. "Have a safe night in the rain, Bradley." The officers escorted them down the front steps. Vanessa immediately began wailing as the cold, heavy rain instantly soaked her hair and her tight dress. The wheels of her luxury suitcase got stuck in the thick mud near the flower beds. Bradley did not even try to help her. He was too busy clutching his trash bag of suits, sprinting toward the street to call a cheap cab because his startup budget could not cover a luxury car service. I watched them stand on the dark, wet sidewalk, drenched and shivering under the flashing lights of the police cruisers. Mr. Caldwell gave me a polite nod, confirming the job was done before walking to his own vehicle. I thanked the officers for their time. I closed the heavy wooden door, shutting out the storm and the pathetic sight of my ex-husband. The house was instantly quiet again. I pulled out my phone and opened the smart home application. With 2 simple taps, I completely wiped Bradley's access codes from the electronic locks securing the perimeter. I walked back into the dining room, poured the remaining wine down the kitchen sink, blew out the anniversary candles, and went upstairs to sleep in my own bed, feeling more peaceful than I had in years. I slept better that night than I had in 5 entire years. I woke up at dawn feeling completely refreshed and untethered from the heavy dead weight I had been carrying. I walked into my massive walk-in closet and bypassed the casual, cozy sweaters Bradley was used to seeing me wear. Instead, I pulled out a tailored charcoal suit, paired with a crisp silk blouse and sharp stilettos. It was a stark departure from the sweatpants-wearing accountant persona I maintained at home. My destination was the gleaming glass and steel high-rise in the center of the financial district. To Bradley, I was just renting a cheap shared desk on a lower floor of this massive corporate hub. He had never once bothered to visit me at work, viewing my career as too mundane to warrant his precious time. I walked through the revolving glass doors of the towering lobby. The pristine marble floors echoed with the sharp, rhythmic clicks of designer heels and polished leather shoes. The morning rush of high-powered executives and financial analysts flowed seamlessly past the strict security desks. I was holding my black coffee ready to head up to my private executive suite when a shrill, obnoxious voice cut straight through the low professional hum of corporate chatter. "There she is. Look at her standing there like she did nothing wrong." I stopped and turned around. Marching across the pristine marble floor like a poorly commanded army were my in-laws, Brenda and Richard. They were flanked by Bradley, who looked thoroughly miserable in the exact same wrinkled suit he had been forced to sleep in at whatever cheap roadside motel he had found in the storm. He had actually done it. Unable to fight his own battles, Bradley had run crying to his mommy, manipulating his status-obsessed parents into fighting his war for him. Brenda was practically vibrating with righteous indignation. She wore a gaudy pearl necklace and a tight tweed jacket, trying desperately to project an air of old money superiority that she absolutely did not possess. Richard trailed slightly behind her, puffing out his chest and trying to look intimidating. "How dare you show your face in public?" Brenda screamed, pointing a shaking, manicured finger right at my face. The bustling lobby went dead silent. Dozens of highly paid professionals stopped right in their tracks, turning to watch the spectacle unfold. Brenda loved an audience. She thrived on public shame and drama. She genuinely thought she could use the gaze of my supposed superiors and coworkers to force me into terrified submission. "You vindictive, cold-hearted woman," Brenda continued, her loud voice echoing sharply off the high vaulted ceilings. "You threw my son out into the freezing rain. You forced him to sleep in a filthy, disgusting motel room. And worse, you threw a pregnant woman onto the streets. You are an absolute monster, Chelsea. You are going to hand over the new keys to that house right now, or we are going to ruin your life." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, looking at the pathetic group standing before me. Bradley was literally hiding behind his mother's shoulder, letting her do all the screaming. It was then that I noticed another figure standing a few paces behind them, looking deeply uncomfortable with this entire public circus. It was Jamal, my brother-in-law. Jamal was 36, a brilliant African-American corporate attorney who had married Bradley's highly toxic sister Megan. Unlike the rest of this manipulative family, Jamal possessed actual integrity and a razor-sharp legal mind. He carried a heavy leather briefcase and maintained a rigid professional distance from Brenda and Richard, completely refusing to join in their unhinged screaming match. He had clearly been dragged here under completely false pretenses, likely fed a fabricated story by Bradley about how I had suffered a sudden psychotic break and illegally locked my husband out without warning. "We brought high-level legal counsel," Richard boomed, stepping forward and gesturing awkwardly toward Jamal. "Jamal is going to sue you for illegal eviction and reckless endangerment of an unborn child. You are going to lose absolutely everything, Chelsea. Your pathetic little accounting job will not save you when we drag you into civil court. You will be paying Vanessa restitution for the emotional distress you caused her baby." Jamal adjusted his glasses, looking like he would rather be swallowed by a sinkhole than be associated with this display. He kept his posture rigid and his expression neutral, carefully assessing the environment rather than launching an attack. "Tell her," Jamal, Brenda snapped, snapping her fingers at him like he was an obedient pet. "Tell this selfish, miserable girl that she is breaking the law. Tell her she has to let my son and his new partner back into their rightful home immediately, or we will press charges before lunch." I looked directly at Brenda, feeling a profound sense of pity for her deep delusion. "It is not their home, Brenda," I said, my voice carrying clearly and calmly across the quiet lobby. "It is my home. My name is exclusively on the deed. My money paid the mortgage every single month while your son played pretend businessman. Your son brought his pregnant mistress into my dining room and demanded I act as their servant. I simply removed the trash from my property." Loud gasps rippled through the gathered crowd of onlookers. Whispers broke out among the executives standing near the elevator banks. Brenda's face turned a violent shade of red. She was not used to being challenged, especially not in public, and certainly not by the daughter-in-law she had always viewed as a submissive nobody. "You are nothing!" Brenda shrieked, taking a threatening step forward, her voice cracking with rage. "My son is a chief executive officer. He is on the verge of securing $50 million in venture capital funding. He is building a massive empire while you sit at a miserable little cubicle crunching numbers for pennies. When his funding comes through this week, we will buy that house out from under you just to tear it down and build a mansion for his real family." Bradley finally stepped out from behind his mother, puffing himself up to look authoritative. "She is right, Chelsea," he sneered, though his bloodshot eyes betrayed his absolute exhaustion. "I tried to be nice to you last night. I tried to include you in my upcoming massive success. Now I am going to let my lawyers handle you. Jamal has already reviewed the local tenant laws. You are going down, and you are going to pay for what you did to Vanessa." I stood my ground, holding my coffee perfectly composed. The entire lobby of elite professionals was watching this ridiculous circus unfold. Bradley crossed his arms, trying to look like a victorious, untouchable tech mogul despite his wrinkled clothes and desperate situation. They honestly thought this public ambush would break my spirit. They thought I would cower in sheer embarrassment and hand over the keys to my own property just to avoid a humiliating scene at my workplace. I shifted my gaze to Jamal, waiting to see exactly what the brilliant corporate attorney was going to do next. I watched Jamal scan the towering lobby. His sharp, intelligent eyes darted past the polished marble pillars and locked onto the massive brushed steel logo mounted directly behind the main reception desk. The letters spelled out Apex Holdings, illuminated by soft white backlighting. I could practically see the gears turning in his brilliant legal mind. He knew exactly what that name meant. For the past 3 months, Bradley had not stopped bragging at every single family dinner about how Apex Holdings was going to be his golden ticket to the Billionaire Boys Club. Jamal physically recoiled. The color seemed to drain from his face as he realized the catastrophic error his in-laws were making. Jamal understood corporate optics better than anyone else in that family. He knew that throwing a trashy, unhinged tantrum in the primary headquarters of a venture capital giant was professional suicide. He knew that the people walking through these revolving doors, holding briefcases and coffee cups, were the exact same investors Bradley was desperate to impress. Jamal stepped forward and firmly grabbed his father-in-law's arm. He leaned in, his voice low but laced with absolute urgency. "Richard, you need to stop right now," Jamal warned, throwing a cautious glance at the gathering crowd of executives. "Look around you. Do you have any idea whose building you are standing in right now? This is Apex Holdings. Bradley's entire $50 million deal depends on the people walking through these doors. You are making a massive scene in front of the exact people who hold his funding." Richard yanked his arm out of Jamal's grip, completely dismissing the frantic warning. He glared at Jamal as if the attorney was being a coward. Bradley, who was too busy glaring at me, had not even noticed the giant logo on the wall. He was too wrapped up in his own wounded ego and his desperate need to regain control of his comfortable suburban life. Brenda did not care about corporate etiquette or venture capital firms. She only cared about dominance and public shame. She ignored Jamal entirely and stepped even closer to me, her face contorted with ugly rage. "I do not care who works here," Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the expensive glass walls. "I want everyone in this building to know exactly what kind of person you are, Chelsea. You are a gold-digging homewrecker who throws innocent pregnant women out into the cold rain. Hand over the keys to my son's house immediately, or I will drag you out of here by your hair." Jamal let out a heavy, frustrated sigh. As a highly successful corporate lawyer, he knew a lost cause when he saw one. He immediately took 3 large steps back, physically severing himself from the group. He adjusted his suit jacket, pulled out his smartphone, and held his leather briefcase tightly against his side, projecting clear non-involvement. He was a smart man. He was not about to ruin his own spotless legal reputation to defend a family of raving narcissists. He stared at his phone screen, pretending to read an important email while his in-laws continued to dig their own graves. Brenda's loud, aggressive threats had finally crossed the line. The quiet whispers of the surrounding corporate professionals turned into outright gasps of shock. From the corner of my eye, I saw the head of building security approaching rapidly. His name was David, a formidable former military officer who ran the lobby with absolute military precision. He was flanked by 2 other large guards in crisp, dark suits. They moved swiftly, cutting through the crowd of whispering onlookers with purpose and authority. "Excuse me, ma'am," David said, his deep voice booming with authority. He stepped directly between me and my raging mother-in-law, forming a solid human shield. "You are creating a hostile disturbance on private commercial property. I am going to have to ask you and your party to lower your voices and exit the premises immediately." Brenda gasped, clutching her faux pearls as if she had just been physically struck. "Do not you dare tell me to leave," she yelled, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at the towering security guard. "Do you know who my son is? He is a chief executive officer. His technology company operates in this very building. He is about to be a multimillionaire. You should be throwing her out." She pointed that same shaking finger right at my chest. "She is just a low-level accountant who stole my son's property and ruined his life." David did not flinch. He did not care about her imaginary wealth or her son's inflated job title. He maintained his strict professional posture. "Mom, if you do not lower your voice and step toward the exit right now, I will have you forcibly removed and cited for trespassing." Bradley finally realized things were spiraling completely out of control. The threat of police involvement and public humiliation terrified him. He stepped forward, putting a placating hand on his mother's shoulder. He tried to puff out his chest and look like a powerful executive, but his wrinkled clothes and bloodshot eyes completely ruined the effect. He looked like exactly what he was, a desperate man who had slept in his clothes at a cheap motel. "Look, my mother is just upset," he told the security guard using his best fake executive voice. "We are not leaving until my wife hands over the keys to my house. I have every right to be standing here. My startup rents office space on the second floor. I am a paying tenant in this building, and I demand that you step aside." David crossed his massive arms over his chest, looking entirely unimpressed by Bradley's pathetic attempt at asserting dominance. "Sir, your tenancy on the lower floors does not grant you the right to harass other individuals in the main lobby. You are causing a massive disruption. This is your final warning to vacate the lobby before I call local law enforcement to assist with your removal." The crowd of onlookers continued to grow. Several high-level directors from my own firm were standing near the elevators watching the entire scene with raised eyebrows. They knew exactly who I was. They knew I was the founder and chairwoman of the very firm this pathetic man was trying to pitch to. I could see the amusement dancing in their eyes as they watched Bradley unknowingly torch his own career. I took another calm sip of my black coffee, relishing the absolute chaos my in-laws had created for themselves. Bradley was sweating again. His bravado was cracking under the intense stare of the security team. Brenda was breathing heavily, still looking like she wanted to lunge across the marble floor and attack me. Richard was standing rigidly, realizing they were heavily outnumbered and completely outclassed in this environment. I looked at David, offering him a small, polite smile. "There is no need to call the police, David," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the tense silence of the lobby. "I can handle this situation myself." Bradley smirked, thinking I was finally backing down to avoid workplace embarrassment. He thought I was terrified of losing my supposed low-level accounting job. He took a confident step forward, holding out his open palm, expecting me to drop the house keys right into his hand. He had absolutely no idea that I was about to end his entire career with a single sentence. I did not wait for Jamal to formulate a legal response, or for my former in-laws to catch their breath. I simply lowered my coffee cup and turned my attention back to David, the towering head of building security. I stepped backwards slightly, positioning myself right in front of the private VIP elevator bank. The polished steel doors slid open automatically, sensing my biometric badge, and I stood there looking impeccably sharp in my tailored charcoal suit, perfectly framed by the glowing interior of the executive lift. I did not argue with Brenda. I did not yell at Richard. I did not even look at Bradley. Instead, I raised my hand and gave a sharp, precise snap of my fingers. David stepped forward, instantly standing at complete attention and awaiting my instruction with the utmost respect. "David," I said, my voice carrying a quiet but absolute authority that cut through the silence of the massive corporate lobby. "The tenant on the second floor, Bradley, and his entire startup team have directly violated the building code of conduct regarding hostile behavior and harassment. Effective immediately, I want every single keycard associated with his company deactivated. Revoke their access to the elevators, the parking garage, and the office suites right now." Bradley let out a loud, obnoxious scoff, throwing his head back in a forced, arrogant laugh. He looked around at the gathered executives, expecting them to join in his amusement. "Are you completely out of your mind, Chelsea?" he sneered. "You are a low-level accountant. You do not have the authority to revoke my office access. I pay expensive rent here. I am a chief executive officer. You are going to get yourself fired for this little stunt." David did not even acknowledge Bradley's rant. He kept his eyes respectfully fixed on me and gave a crisp nod. "Right away, ma'am. Consider it done." David reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder and barked a swift numeric code to the central control room. Within seconds, the electronic turnstiles leading to the lower floor office suites flashed from glowing green to a harsh, solid red. The realization that I actually wielded real power in this building hit Bradley like a physical blow. The smug grin melted right off his face. He lunged toward the turnstiles, frantically slamming his digital badge against the glass scanner. A loud buzzing sound echoed through the lobby, indicating his access was entirely denied. He slammed the badge against the glass again and again, panic rising in his chest as the red light flashed repeatedly. Brenda began shrieking all over again, accusing the security team of conspiring with a psychotic woman to ruin her brilliant son. David and his guards did not hesitate. They swiftly corralled the screaming family, physically backing the entire toxic group out the heavy glass doors and onto the busy morning sidewalk. Jamal had already slipped away through a side exit, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the humiliating display. I turned my back on the pathetic scene and stepped fully into the VIP elevator. The doors closed silently, shutting out the noise of my ruined in-laws. As the elevator shot upward toward the top floor executive suite of Apex Holdings, I felt a profound sense of anticipation. I stepped into my massive corner office overlooking the entire financial district and sat behind my expansive glass desk. My phone immediately began to vibrate relentlessly. Bradley had decided to retaliate the only way a desperate narcissist knew how. He had gone live on social media right from the sidewalk outside my building. I opened the application and watched his face fill my screen. He was pacing back and forth, furiously holding his phone up high so his thousands of followers could see the corporate high-rise behind him. "My soon-to-be ex-wife is having a complete psychotic break," Bradley announced to his audience, his voice dripping with fake victimhood. "She illegally locked me out of my own house last night because she is insanely jealous of my success. Now she is manipulating building security to lock my startup out of our own offices. She is having a mental breakdown trying to sabotage my life because she knows I am moving on to bigger and better things without her." He paused dramatically, running a hand through his messy, unwashed hair, looking directly into the camera lens to garner maximum sympathy. "But her crazy little stunts will not work," Bradley continued, puffing out his chest. "In just 3 days, I am stepping onto the main stage at the annual pitching gala. My company is securing a guaranteed $50 million investment from Apex Holdings. I am about to change the entire tech world, and Chelsea simply cannot handle that she will not be along for the ride. She is bitter, she is ordinary, and she is trying to drag me down. But real visionaries do not let petty, jealous women stop them." The comments on his live stream were flooded with support from his arrogant tech friends and Vanessa, who was actively cheering him on from the chat, calling me a toxic loser. It was a pathetic display of arrogance, built entirely on a foundation of sand. I closed the application feeling completely unbothered by his digital temper tantrum. Just then, my executive assistant walked into my office carrying a thick, black embossed envelope. "This was just hand-delivered to the front desk for you," she said, placing it carefully on my desk before stepping out. I opened the heavy envelope. Inside was a glossy gold-foiled VIP ticket to the exact pitching gala Bradley had just been bragging about online. Attached to the shiny ticket was a handwritten sticky note. The messy, aggressive scrawl belonged unmistakably to Bradley. "Come watch me become a multi-millionaire," the note read. "Sit in the back and see exactly what you threw away. You will be begging me to take you back by Monday." He actually thought sending me a ticket to his supposed triumph would be the ultimate insult. He wanted me to sit in the audience and watch him shake hands with the top executives of Apex Holdings. He wanted to rub his imaginary wealth right in my face and watch me cry over losing a brilliant tech genius. He wanted to break me publicly just to satisfy his enormous fragile ego. I picked up the golden ticket and traced the embossed lettering with my thumb. A slow, knowing smile spread across my face. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city below, feeling the absolute certainty of the storm I was about to unleash. I picked up my pen and wrote a quick reply to his courier. "I accept the invitation and I will definitely be there." 3 days later, the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive downtown hotel was transformed into a glittering battleground. The annual pitching gala was the pinnacle of the tech industry calendar. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over a sea of velvet-draped tables and towering floral arrangements. Billionaire investors, venture capitalists, and desperate startup founders mingled in the crowded space. The air was thick with the smell of expensive cologne and the desperate hunger for funding. I stepped through the gilded double doors, feeling the familiar electric buzz of the room. I was not wearing my usual corporate armor. Instead, I chose a floor-length midnight blue gown. It had no flashy logos or gaudy embellishments. It was a masterpiece of stealth wealth cut with architectural precision that fit me flawlessly. I paired it with a single diamond pendant and a sharp, clean updo. I looked exactly like the apex predator I was about to be. It did not take me long to spot the circus. Bradley and his entire entourage were holding court near the center of the room. They looked like they had robbed a designer boutique blind. Bradley was wearing a velvet tuxedo jacket that was entirely too tight, straining across his shoulders. Richard stood beside him wearing a shiny silver tie that caught the light in the most obnoxious way possible, while Brenda was squeezed into a sequined dress that made her look like a walking disco ball. But Vanessa was the true spectacle. She had poured herself into a bright red maternity gown that left absolutely nothing to the imagination. She was draped in heavy gold jewelry I knew for a fact Bradley had purchased using stolen company runway funds. I watched from a distance as she paraded around the room clutching a glass of sparkling cider and forcing herself into conversations with highly respected tech executives. She was loudly introducing herself to everyone who made eye contact as the future wife of the chief executive officer. The seasoned investors were giving her polite, tight-lipped smiles clearly put off by her sheer lack of class, but Vanessa was far too delusional to notice. I took a slow breath and began to walk across the ballroom floor. I did not try to hide. I walked with absolute purpose, my heels sinking slightly into the thick, luxurious carpet. It took exactly 40 seconds for Brenda to spot me. Her eyes widened, and she immediately tapped Bradley's arm, pointing frantically in my direction. The entire toxic group turned to face me. Like a pack of rabid hyenas, they immediately broke away from their networking attempts and marched directly into my path, intercepting me before I could even reach the bar. "I cannot believe you actually showed up," Bradley sneered, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "I sent you that ticket as a joke, Chelsea. I wanted you to realize how out of your league you are, but you actually thought you belonged here." Brenda let out a loud, dramatic sigh, looking at my midnight blue gown with extreme disdain. "Did you rent that off the clearance rack?" She mocked, her voice intentionally loud to draw the attention of the surrounding guests. "You stick out like a sore thumb among all these wealthy, successful people. You are embarrassing my son just by breathing the same air as him." Vanessa stepped forward, placing a protective hand over her pregnant belly. She looked me up and down and let out a harsh nasal laugh. "It is actually pathetic," she scoffed. "You are a basic accountant, Chelsea. You probably had to drain your entire savings account just to afford the parking fee tonight. Why do not you just go home and spare yourself the humiliation? Brad is about to become a tech giant and you are literally nobody." I did not flinch. I did not defend my dress or my career. I simply stood there letting them hurl their insults, absorbing every single ounce of their unwarranted arrogance. Bradley, emboldened by my silence, decided to take his cruelty a step further. He looked around the ballroom and spotted a stressed-looking event coordinator rushing past with an earpiece. Bradley reached out and grabbed the young woman's arm, stopping her in her tracks. "Excuse me," Bradley said, projecting his voice with fake authority. "I am Bradley, the founder of the startup receiving the $50 million headline investment tonight. This woman here," he pointed a sharp finger right at my chest, "is my bitter ex-wife. She is completely unhinged, and she is currently harassing my pregnant fiancé. I cannot have her sitting anywhere near the VIP section. It is a massive security risk to my investors." The young event coordinator looked terrified. She glanced at my simple dress and then at Bradley's flashy velvet tuxedo. She did not know who I was. The board members of Apex Holdings maintained strict anonymity for me, and the event staff only had a list of names, not photographs. Wanting to avoid any disruption before the main event, the coordinator immediately caved to Bradley's demands. "I am so sorry, Mom," the coordinator said, turning to me with an apologetic but firm expression. I am going to have to ask you to relocate. We have an overflow table at the back of the room. Bradley smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. Vanessa let out a victorious little giggle, leaning her head on Bradley's shoulder. They had successfully leveraged their imaginary status to bully the staff into degrading me. They expected me to argue to cause a scene or to run out of the ballroom in tears. Lead the way, I told the coordinator, my voice perfectly calm. Bradley frowned, clearly disappointed that I was not putting up a fight. Have fun sitting with the garbage, he called out as I walked away. The coordinator escorted me past the beautiful velvet tables, past the glittering centerpieces, and all the way to the absolute back of the massive ballroom. She seated me at a tiny, wobbly table, tucked into a dark corner, right next to the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen and the hallway leading to the public restrooms. The smell of dish soap and industrial cleaner hung in the air. Waiters rushed past my chair carrying heavy trays of dirty dishes, plates clattering loudly every few seconds. It was undoubtedly the worst seat in the entire venue. I sat down on the uncomfortable wooden chair, smoothing my silk skirt. From this dark, obscured corner, I had a perfect panoramic view of the entire ballroom. I could see the brightly lit main stage where the Apex Holdings executives were preparing to speak. I could see Bradley and Vanessa taking their seats at the prime VIP table right in the front row. They were clinking their glasses together, toasting to their impending imaginary wealth. I also spotted Jamal sitting quietly beside his wife Megan, looking deeply uncomfortable with the flashy display his in-laws were putting on. I reached for a glass of sparkling water resting on the cheap tablecloth. I took a slow sip, settling into the shadows. The clattering of the kitchen doors behind me did not bother me at all. I was perfectly content sitting in the dark because I knew exactly what was about to happen. I watched Bradley puff out his chest and smile at the stage, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just forced the singular person who controlled his financial existence to sit next to the trash cans. I waited in the shadows, ready for the slaughter to begin. From my secluded vantage point, I had a perfect view of Bradley's pathetic performance. He was working the room with the desperate manic energy of a man who knew his entire life was an unstable house of cards. He bounced from table to table, shaking hands with established venture capitalists, who were clearly only tolerating his presence out of basic professional courtesy. He laughed too loudly at their jokes and aggressively pitched his startup to anyone who made the mistake of making eye contact. Vanessa trailed behind him like a gaudy red accessory, looking completely out of place as she awkwardly tried to insert herself into high-level financial discussions. Then I saw Jamal stand up from his seat. My brother-in-law smoothed his impeccably tailored suit and walked purposefully toward Bradley. Jamal was not a fool. As a highly successful corporate lawyer, his entire career was built on identifying risk and mitigating disaster. I watched as Jamal firmly grasped Bradley's shoulder and steered him away from a group of wealthy angel investors. Bradley rolled his eyes, looking deeply annoyed at the sudden interruption. Wanting privacy for the confrontation, Jamal unknowingly guided Bradley straight toward the back of the ballroom, right toward the dark hallway near the kitchen doors where I was seated in the shadows. They stopped just a few feet away from my tiny wobbly table. They were so wrapped up in their argument they did not even notice me sitting silently in the dim lighting. "What is your problem?" Jamal Bradley hissed, keeping his voice low but laced with venom. "I am networking. I am about to be the most important man in this room." Jamal crossed his arms, looking down at Bradley with absolute professional disdain. "You are about to commit federal fraud," Bradley Jamal said, his voice sharp and precise. "I looked at the preliminary term sheets you left on the dining table at my house last weekend. Your user acquisition numbers do not match your revenue streams at all. You are inflating your active subscriber base by at least 400%. If you sign a $50 million contract with Apex Holdings tonight, using those fabricated metrics, you are committing wire fraud. That is a federal offense. You will go to federal prison." Bradley let out a harsh, arrogant laugh, throwing his head back. He looked at Jamal as if the brilliant attorney was a naive child. "You have absolutely no idea how the tech industry works, Jamal. Everyone inflates their projections. It is called selling the vision. Once I get that $50 million check from Apex, I can use the cash to actually acquire the users. It is a standard bridge strategy. It is a felony, Jamal corrected his tone, leaving no room for debate. Apex Holdings is not a group of amateur angel investors. They have the most aggressive forensic accounting team on the East Coast. They will audit your servers. They will find the massive discrepancy. I am telling you right now as your brother-in-law and as a lawyer to walk away tonight before you end up in a concrete cell. Bradley's face twisted into an ugly defensive sneer. His fragile ego could not handle being corrected, especially by a man who was infinitely more successful and respected than he was. You need to back off and stick to your boring corporate paperwork, Bradley spat, stepping uncomfortably close to Jamal. Do not ever try to lecture me about business. The only reason you are even sitting in the VIP section tonight is because my sister brought you. You are just an affirmative action hire trying to play with the big boys. You do not understand how real wealth is built, so keep your mouth shut and watch me make history. Jamal did not flinch. He did not raise his voice or react to the blatant, disgusting racism Bradley had just hurled at him. He simply looked at his brother-in-law with a profound sense of pity and complete disgust. He slowly shook his head, taking a deliberate step backward. You are entirely on your own, Bradley, Jamal said quietly. Enjoy the stage. Jamal turned on his heel and walked straight back to his table, completely washing his hands of the impending disaster. I sat in the shadows, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water, thoroughly satisfied that Jamal had inadvertently confirmed exactly what my forensic team had already discovered. Just as Jamal sat down, the heavy crystal chandeliers above us began to dim. The ambient classical music faded out, replaced by a sharp spotlight cutting through the darkness and illuminating the main stage. The managing director of Apex Holdings stepped up to the clear acrylic podium, tapping the microphone gently. A sudden hush fell over the massive ballroom. The clinking of expensive glassware ceased as hundreds of powerful industry leaders turned their attention to the front of the room. Bradley practically vibrated with excitement. He rushed back to the VIP table, standing right next to Vanessa. The managing director began speaking about the future of technology, the shifting landscape of digital innovation, and the rigorous selection process for their $50 million flagship investment. After months of intense deliberation and countless pitches, we have finally made our decision, the managing director announced, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. Bradley did not even wait for his company name to be called. He stood up triumphantly, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape. He boldly buttoned his tight velvet suit jacket, flashing a smug, victorious smile down at his cheering parents and Vanessa. He stepped out into the center aisle, puffing out his chest perfectly, ready to walk up the steps and accept his massive check. The managing director raised a single hand, bringing the polite applause to an immediate halt. Bradley froze, with his foot hovering over the first carpeted step leading up to the stage. He looked confused for a fraction of a second, but quickly rearranged his features into a patient, knowing smile. He clearly thought this was simply a theatrical pause, a dramatic build-up designed to make his grand entrance even more spectacular. He adjusted his velvet lapels and waited for the praise to continue. But the managing director did not look at Bradley. He looked out over the sea of wealthy investors and powerful executives, adjusting the microphone stand with a highly serious expression. Before we sign the final contracts for this unprecedented funding round, there is a strict protocol we must follow. The managing director announced, his voice echoing clearly through the massive speakers. A flagship investment of this magnitude requires the ultimate authority. I must invite the true anonymous founder and chairwoman of Apex Holdings to the stage to make the final executive decision. A collective murmur of shock and intense curiosity rippled through the grand ballroom. For years, the identity of the Apex Holdings founder had been the biggest mystery in the financial sector. Speculation ran wild among the venture capitalists. People craned their necks looking toward the VIP tables in the front, expecting some famous reclusive billionaire to stand up from the shadows of the elite seating area. Bradley stood awkwardly in the center aisle, looking over his shoulder. His arrogant smile faltered slightly as he realized he was no longer the center of attention. He was just a guy blocking the walkway waiting for the real power in the room to reveal herself. I sat in the dark, dingy corner next to the kitchen doors. I took one final calming breath and pushed my cheap wooden chair back. The legs scraped harshly against the floorboards. The sound was not particularly loud, but in the hushed anticipation of the ballroom, it drew the attention of a few waiters standing nearby. I stood up, smoothing the midnight blue silk of my gown. At that exact moment, the event production team, who had been carefully briefed by my executive staff hours earlier, executed their orders. The heavy crystal chandeliers illuminating the front of the room completely blacked out. The ambient golden lighting vanished, plunging the VIP section into sudden darkness. A second later, a single blinding white spotlight snapped on. The beam of pure, piercing light cut sharply through the pitch-black ballroom, completely bypassing the front rows and landing directly on me in the very back corner next to the trash cans. The entire grand ballroom fell dead silent. The murmurs instantly evaporated. The clinking of glasses ceased entirely. Hundreds of the most powerful people in the country turned in their seats, following the beam of light to the back of the room. They stared in absolute stunned silence as I stepped out from behind the wobbly overflow table. I did not rush. I walked with lethal, measured confidence. Every step of my stilettos sinking into the thick carpet felt like a heartbeat, echoing in the completely silent room. As I moved forward, the crowd naturally parted, creating a wide, clear path for me. The powerful executives who had ignored me all night now stepped back respectfully, lowering their heads as I passed. The people who had watched my in-laws mock my dress just an hour ago were now staring at me with profound, undisguised awe. Bradley was still standing in the center aisle. He turned completely around, squinting against the harsh glare of the spotlight moving toward him. It took his brain a few agonizing seconds to process what his eyes were seeing. He saw the midnight blue dress he had mocked. He saw the face of the woman he had called a boring, unambitious accountant. He saw his discarded ex-wife walking toward him not as a defeated victim, but as the absolute titan of the industry he was begging for survival. The realization hit him with the force of a runaway freight train. All the blood rushed from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. His jaw slacked, and the muscles in his hand completely gave out. The expensive crystal wine glass he had been holding loosely in his fingers simply slipped from his grip. It hit the floor right at his feet, shattering into dozens of sharp, glittering pieces. The loud crash of the breaking glass echoed violently in the silent ballroom, but nobody moved to clean it up. I kept my eyes locked on the stage, refusing to even acknowledge his existence as I approached the front of the room. Vanessa was standing right next to the VIP table. The smug entitlement she had been parading around all night vanished instantly. The horrifying realization that she had just spent the entire evening brutally insulting the billionaire who controlled her entire future crashed down on her shoulders. Her face turned a blotchy, terrified red. She gripped the edge of the velvet-draped table, her knuckles turning bone white as her legs completely gave out beneath her. She sank heavily into her chair, gasping for air, looking like she was going to be physically sick right there on the expensive tablecloth. Right beside her, Brenda and Richard were completely paralyzed. They were trapped in a state of absolute shock, unable to process the magnificent reality unfolding right in front of them. Brenda stood frozen with her mouth hanging wide open, her tacky sequined dress suddenly looking incredibly cheap under the harsh glare of the spotlight. The woman she had screamed at in the lobby, the woman she had called a gold-digging, nobody was currently commanding the respect of every single billionaire in the building. Richard looked like he had forgotten how to breathe, his eyes bulging out of his head as he stared at me in sheer, unadulterated terror. I reached the center aisle. Bradley was standing right in my path, trembling uncontrollably, his breathing ragged and shallow. He looked at me with wild, pleading eyes, silently begging me to tell him this was all some elaborate nightmare. I did not break my stride. I did not offer him a single glance of pity. I stepped right over the shattered pieces of his wineglass, leaving him standing there in his own pathetic mess. I ascended the short staircase leading up to the main stage. The managing director stepped aside immediately, bowing his head in a gesture of profound professional respect. I walked past him and took my rightful place behind the clear acrylic podium, resting my hands lightly on the edges. I looked out over the massive sea of faces, finally allowing my gaze to drop down to the front row, where Bradley was staring up at me, completely broken. I adjusted the slim microphone extending from the clear acrylic podium. The simple movement produced a soft electronic hum that instantly commanded the absolute attention of every single billionaire venture capitalist and industry leader in the grand ballroom. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to shout over any crowd to be heard. I stood perfectly straight, leaning forward slightly, and spoke with a deadly calm precision that carried effortlessly through the massive speaker system. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady and unwavering. "For those who do not know me personally, my name is Chelsea. For the past 5 years, I have operated as the anonymous founder and chairwoman of Apex Holdings, quietly building this firm into the premier venture capital entity it is today." A collective breath was drawn across the room. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a thick, heavy dossier. The front cover was stamped with a bold, aggressive red seal, indicating a completed and verified forensic audit. I lifted the file high enough for the front row to see the stark warning labels before dropping it flat onto the acrylic podium. The heavy thud echoed through the silent room like a gavel striking a judge's block, finalizing a damning verdict. Tonight we were scheduled to finalize a $50 million flagship investment into a highly anticipated technology startup, I continued. Our funding is specifically designed to elevate true innovators who operate with absolute transparency and integrity. We look for leaders who respect the weight of the capital they are given. Unfortunately, during our mandatory late-stage financial audits, my forensic accounting team uncovered a series of catastrophic irregularities regarding tonight's recipient. I looked directly down at Bradley. He was trembling so violently that his knees were visibly shaking beneath his tight velvet suit. He tried to open his mouth to speak to defend himself, but his throat was completely dry and no sound came out. The wealthy investors seated around his VIP table physically leaned away from him, putting immediate, obvious distance between themselves and a sinking ship. They were apex predators of the financial world, and they could smell blood in the water. It is my strict fiduciary duty to inform this entire ecosystem that the $50 million investment deal is permanently canceled, I announced. Bradley flinched as if I had shot him. The startup in question, founded by Bradley, has engaged in severe systematic corporate fraud, I declared, projecting my voice to reach the very back of the room. Our auditors have confirmed beyond a shadow of a doubt that the company completely falsified its user acquisition metrics. They artificially inflated their active subscriber base by over 400% to intentionally deceive potential investors into handing over millions of dollars. Low murmurs of absolute disgust rippled through the ballroom. In the high-stakes tech industry, faking user metrics to secure venture capital was not just a simple calculation error, it was a federal crime. I watched several prominent angel investors immediately pull out their phones, likely messaging their own legal teams to cancel any pending secondary deals they had discussed with him during the cocktail hour. But the fraud does not end with fabricated projections, I said, opening the red-stamped dossier and turning to a meticulously highlighted page. We also discovered a massive trail of blatant embezzlement. Hundreds of thousands of dollars from the startup's existing runway funds have been illegally siphoned out of their corporate accounts. I shifted my gaze directly to Vanessa, who was shrinking down into her chair. This capital, which was legally meant for developer salaries and operational costs, was instead used to purchase luxury designer handbags, heavy gold jewelry, and a sports car for the chief executive officer's personal assistant and current mistress, I stated clearly. The room erupted into harsh, judgmental whispers. All eyes snapped to Vanessa, who was currently clutching the very designer bag I had just exposed as stolen property. She looked like she wanted the polished floor to open up and swallow her whole. The polite smiles the seasoned investors had given her earlier completely vanished, replaced by expressions of pure, unadulterated revulsion. Right beside her, Brenda and Richard were gasping for air, gripping each other in sheer mortification as the elite society they so desperately wanted to join looked at them like they were common criminals. "Chelsea, please," Bradley croaked out. His voice cracked, echoing weakly in the massive room. He took a pathetic, stumbling step forward toward the stage, raising his hands in a desperate begging gesture. "Do not do this. It is a mistake. I can fix the numbers. I can explain everything to the board." "You do not have the capacity to fix anything, Bradley," I replied, my voice cutting through his pathetic pleas like a freshly sharpened blade. "You are a massive liability. You are a fraud. And as of this exact moment, you are permanently blacklisted from Apex Holdings and every single affiliate venture capital firm in this country." I stared him down, watching the final shreds of his arrogant ego evaporate into nothing. "No reputable investor in this room will ever hand you a single dime," I promised him. "Your career in the technology ecosystem is entirely over. You are done." I closed the thick red dossier with a sharp, definitive snap. I looked past Bradley's broken, trembling figure and made eye contact with Jamal, who was sitting quietly at his table. My brilliant brother-in-law gave me a slow, deeply respectful nod, acknowledging that absolute justice had just been served. "Thank you all for attending tonight," I said, addressing the stunned ballroom one last time. "Apex Holdings remains entirely committed to funding ethical innovation. Please enjoy the rest of your evening." I stepped away from the clear acrylic podium, taking my dossier with me. I did not look back at Bradley as I walked off the stage, leaving him standing utterly ruined and completely isolated in the center of the glittering room. I stepped out of the grand ballroom and into the cool night air, leaving the shattered remains of Bradley's fragile ego behind me. My private driver was waiting at the curb with the engine running. As the sleek black car pulled away from the luxury venue, my phone began to vibrate with a relentless, steady rhythm. The dominoes were already falling. In the highly interconnected, fast-paced world of venture capital, news of a publicly blacklisted founder travels faster than the speed of light. By the time I woke up the next morning, Bradley's entire imaginary empire had collapsed into absolute dust. My executive team sent me a highly detailed briefing over my morning coffee. The fallout was spectacular and immediate. The angel investors who had previously backed his startup panicked the moment they verified my public allegations regarding the fabricated user metrics and the embezzled runway funds. They immediately triggered their emergency clawback clauses and pulled every single cent of their existing funding overnight. To make matters exponentially worse, the commercial banks caught wind of the federal wire fraud implications. They swiftly froze his corporate accounts and called in his massive business loans, demanding immediate repayment in full. Bradley was not just completely broke. He was buried under an insurmountable mountain of toxic corporate debt, with federal investigators undoubtedly circling his unraveled startup. But Bradley was not the only one drowning in the wreckage of his own breathtaking arrogance. I sat in my spacious home office reviewing the financial shockwaves when the security alarm at my front gate chimed loudly. My mansion sits at the end of a long private driveway, heavily secured by tall wrought iron gates and high-definition cameras. I pulled up the live security feed on my desktop monitor. Standing outside in the crisp morning air, looking absolutely frantic, were my former in-laws. Brenda and Richard were completely unrecognizable from the boastful, entitled couple who had paraded around the gala just hours ago. Their expensive designer clothes from the previous night were rumpled, and they were desperately pressing the buzzer on the intercom panel over and over again. They looked absolutely terrified. I knew exactly why they were panicking. During the forensic audit of Bradley's startup, my team had uncovered a deeply pathetic detail. Brenda and Richard, so blinded by their son's inflated promises and their own desperate hunger for high society status, had secretly remortgaged their entire retirement fund. They had taken out massive predatory loans against their own home to quietly invest in Bradley's sinking ship. They honestly believed they were going to triple their net worth when Apex Holdings handed over the $50 million check. Now, with the startup completely liquidated and the banks aggressively seizing assets, Brenda and Richard were facing absolute catastrophic bankruptcy. They were about to lose their home, their pensions, and the lavish lifestyle they so fiercely pretended to afford. I pressed the button on my desk console, activating the two-way audio feed. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice echoing clearly through the speaker at the front gate. "Chelsea." "Oh, thank God!" Brenda cried out, rushing closer to the camera lens. Her face was heavily streaked with running mascara, and her voice was high and frantic. "Please, Chelsea, you have to let us in. We need to talk to you right now. You have to help us." "We have absolutely nothing to talk about, Brenda," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly detached. "You are trespassing on my private property." "Please." Richard begged, his usual blustering pride completely gone. He actually dropped to his knees on the hard concrete pavement, gripping the thick iron bars of the gate. "We are going to lose our house, Chelsea. The bank just called us this morning. Bradley lost all the money. Our entire retirement is gone. We have absolutely nothing left." "That sounds like a terrible financial decision," I stated coldly. "You should take that up with your brilliant chief executive officer son. I am sure he can sell you a vision to fix it." "It is not his fault," Brenda wailed, pressing her hands against her face in a dramatic display of agony. "It is that horrible woman. Vanessa manipulated him. She used her pregnancy to trick him into buying her all those expensive things. My son is a good man, Chelsea. He just made a mistake. She poisoned his mind." The sheer delusion was staggering. Even now, facing total financial ruin, they refused to hold their golden boy accountable. They were desperately trying to shift the blame to his mistress, acting as if Bradley had simply stumbled into federal fraud by accident. "Vanessa did not forge user metrics to steal venture capital," I reminded them sharply. "Vanessa did not hand over your retirement funds to a failing startup. Your son is a grown man who committed massive corporate fraud to fund his own arrogant lifestyle. He stole from his investors and he stole from you." "Chelsea, we are family," Brenda sobbed, sliding down to her knees right beside her husband. The two of them were literally kneeling on the cold pavement outside my gate, crying hysterically. "You have billions of dollars. We know who you are now. You can fix this. You can bail us out. Please do not let us end up on the streets. We will do anything you ask. You made your choices." I told them, my voice devoid of a single ounce of sympathy. "When your son brought his pregnant mistress into my dining room and threw divorce papers in my face, you supported him. When you thought I was a low-level accountant, you marched into my lobby and tried to publicly humiliate me. You called me a gold digger. You cheered while he tried to steal the home I paid for. You only consider us family now because you are desperate for my money." "We were wrong," Richard wept, his shoulders shaking violently. "We are so sorry. Just give us a loan. We will pay you back every single cent." "I do not fund toxic investments," I replied, "and I certainly do not bail out the people who actively cheered for my destruction. You gambled your entire future on Bradley's fragile ego, and you lost everything. Do not ever return to this property again, or I will have you arrested for harassment." I released the intercom button, cutting the audio feed entirely. Through the silent security monitor, I watched the two of them collapse against the heavy iron gates, weeping into their hands as the reality of their self-inflicted ruin finally crushed them. I turned off the screen, picked up my coffee, and went back to work, leaving them sobbing on the pavement exactly where they belonged. I returned to my pristine office at Apex Holdings. The sprawling glass desk was covered in meticulously organized financial ledgers. My lead forensic accountant, a sharp woman who had been with me since the early days of the firm, placed a fresh stack of bank records right in front of me. The commercial banks had completely frozen Bradley's startup accounts at the crack of dawn, but my team already had full legal access to the digital paper trail during our deep dive due diligence. I opened the thick folder, tracing the highlighted transactions with my index finger. Bradley was not just an arrogant fool, he was staggeringly sloppy. He actually thought he could hide his massive embezzlement behind vague corporate expense codes and shell vendor names. But financial forensics is an exact science, and numbers absolutely never lie. I scanned the chronological list of wire transfers. 3 months ago, he authorized a wire for $85,000 categorized as a marketing expenditure. I cross-referenced the receiving routing number. It did not go to a marketing agency or an advertising firm. It went directly to a luxury automotive dealership located 2 states over. Bradley had used company runway funds to purchase a bright red convertible sports car for Vanessa. He registered it entirely in her name. A few weeks later, another massive wire transfer was initiated, $40,000 categorized as hardware procurement. That money was wired directly to an elite jewelry boutique in New York. I remembered seeing Vanessa parading around the pitching gala, wearing heavy gold chains and diamond tennis bracelets. She was literally wearing the stolen salaries of Bradley's software developers around her neck. My lead accountant tapped a specific column on the spreadsheet. The moment he authorized those electronic transfers across state lines, it stopped being simple corporate mismanagement. She stated, her voice completely professional and detached. It officially became federal wire fraud. The authorities will be involved by the end of the week. I nodded, leaning back in my leather ergonomic chair. Bradley had handed the federal government an airtight case wrapped in a neat little bow. He was facing mandatory minimum sentencing, and there was absolutely no way out of it. My thoughts drifted to the cheap, dingy roadside motel where Bradley and Vanessa were currently hiding out. I could easily picture the miserable scene unfolding within those cheap, thin walls. Bradley was undoubtedly pacing the stained carpet, screaming into his phone as investors screamed back. He was completely broke, his reputation destroyed, and the looming threat of a federal prison sentence was hovering right over his head. His fragile ego must have been violently unraveling, turning him into a volatile, raging mess. And sitting right there on the edge of a lumpy motel bed was Vanessa. She was 25, incredibly selfish, and entirely driven by superficial greed. She had eagerly played the role of the devoted mistress because she thought Bradley was her golden ticket to high society. She wanted the penthouse suites, the designer wardrobes, and the multi-million-dollar status. She never signed up to be the pregnant girlfriend of a broke, disgraced felon living out of a plastic trash bag. I knew human nature, especially the nature of greedy, opportunistic people. Vanessa was sitting in that miserable room watching Bradley completely lose his mind, and she was realizing that she was permanently tied to a sinking ship. Even worse, she was driving a stolen sports car and wearing stolen diamonds. The federal investigators would not just stop at Bradley, they would seize her assets. They would freeze her accounts. They would look at her as a willing accessory to a massive financial crime. Rats always flee when the water starts rising. Vanessa was cornered, terrified and desperate to save her own skin before the federal agents kicked down the motel door. She needed a way out, and she needed untraceable cash to completely disappear. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corporate headquarters, watching the morning traffic flow through the financial district. I knew she was going to crack. It was only a matter of time before the pressure of Bradley's violent, desperate anger pushed her right to the absolute edge. Right on cue, my private encrypted cell phone resting on my glass desk lit up. The screen displayed an incoming text message from an unknown, unsaved number. But I did not need caller identification to know exactly who was on the other end of that digital line. I picked up the device and opened the encrypted application. The message was frantic, riddled with typos, and completely stripped of the arrogant, confident tone Vanessa had used just 24 hours ago in my dining room. "Chelsea, please, you have to help me," the message read. "He has completely lost his mind. He is smashing things in the room. I have to get out of here right now, but my credit cards are all declining. I know things you need to see. I have access to his real financial books. I have the unencrypted hard drive. I will give you everything to bury him, but I need cash to leave the state today. Please respond." I read the pathetic, desperate plea twice. Vanessa was officially offering to sell out the man she had claimed was her brilliant soulmate. She was dangling the final nail in Bradley's coffin, hoping I would be willing to pay a premium for his ultimate destruction. She thought I was just an angry, bitter ex-wife desperate for revenge. She had no idea that I already had all the financial proof I needed. But I was not about to let a perfectly good opportunity slip through my fingers. Vanessa wanted a dirty back alley deal. She wanted to grab a suitcase of cash and vanish into the wind, leaving Bradley to rot. I placed my phone back on the desk and smiled. I tapped the screen and began typing out my response, setting the stage for the final trap. I stared at the glowing screen of my encrypted phone resting on the pristine glass surface of my desk. The frantic message from Vanessa sat there like a digital confession of her own pathetic cowardice. She was officially offering to sell out the man she had proudly flaunted just a few days ago. The arrogant mistress who had demanded I pack my bags and vacate my own home was now begging me for a lifeline. I picked up the device, feeling the cool metal edge against my palm. I did not rush to reply. I let her sit in that cheap motel room, sweating and panicking while the typing indicator remained completely blank. After 5 agonizing minutes for her, I finally tapped the screen. I typed 2 simple words: "I am listening." The response was instantaneous. The digital typing bubbles flashed frantically as Vanessa pounded on her keyboard. "He is completely losing his mind," she wrote, her messages coming through in rapid, disjointed bursts. "He smashed the motel television. He is throwing things against the wall and screaming at his lawyers on the phone. I cannot stay here, Chelsea. He is going to drag me down with him." I grabbed his personal backup hard drive from his briefcase when he went outside to yell at the motel manager. "It has everything. It has his real unencrypted financial books, the hidden offshore accounts, and direct proof of his tax evasion schemes. I will give it all to you. I will give you the exact weapon you need to bury him forever. But I need $100,000 in untraceable cash. I need to leave the state tonight before the federal agents show up." I read her demands, and a cold laugh escaped my lips. $100,000 was absolute pocket change for Apex Holdings. It was a rounding error in my daily operational budget, but paying off my ex-husband's greedy mistress was against every single principle I possessed. Furthermore, I did not actually need her stolen hard drive. My elite team of forensic accountants had already compiled a mountain of undeniable evidence that would send Bradley to federal prison for years. But this hard drive was the ultimate final nail in his coffin. More importantly, it was the absolute perfect bait for the trap I was meticulously building. I knew that Vanessa was not just running from Bradley, she was running to protect the massive secret growing inside her. I had already uncovered the truth about her pregnancy during my audit. The baby she was carrying did not belong to Bradley. It belonged to his chief financial officer. Vanessa was demanding cash to flee the state so she could escape the fallout and leave Bradley holding the bag for a child that was not even his. "Send me undeniable proof," I typed back, keeping my demands brief and authoritative. My phone buzzed a few seconds later. Vanessa sent a clear photograph of a sleek silver hard drive resting on a stained motel bedspread. She followed it with a secondary image, a picture taken of a laptop screen showing a deeply hidden directory file titled with an offshore shell company name I immediately recognized from my own investigations. She was telling the truth. She really had stolen his most damning secrets. "I will pay you the $100,000, I replied, "but we do this entirely on my terms. We meet in public, tonight at 8 o'clock sharp. You bring the drive and I will bring a briefcase. If you involve anyone else or attempt to change the location, the deal is permanently canceled, and I will personally alert the federal authorities to your exact location." Vanessa agreed immediately, sending a flurry of grateful, desperate messages that I completely ignored. I had one final choice to make. I needed to select the perfect location for this exchange. I wanted a place that carried heavy emotional weight, a place that would make the impending destruction feel incredibly poetic. I typed out the address for Le Petit Chateau. It was an exceptionally high-end French restaurant located in the heart of the city. It was famous for its dim romantic lighting, its classical string quartets, and its impossibly strict reservation policies. But more importantly, it was the exact same restaurant where Bradley had gotten down on one knee and proposed to me 5 years ago. I saw him. With the meeting set, I initiated the second phase of my plan. I could not just have Vanessa at the restaurant. I needed an audience. Specifically, I needed the man she was currently betraying. I used a secure burner service to send an anonymous, untraceable text message directly to Bradley's phone. "I know exactly who destroyed your company," the spoofed message read. "Meet me at Le Petit Chateau tonight at 8:15 if you want the undeniable proof. Come alone." The timing was beautifully orchestrated. Vanessa would arrive at 8 o'clock expecting a smooth, lucrative transaction. Bradley would arrive exactly 15 minutes later, walking right through the front doors just in time to catch his beloved, loyal mistress handing his entire life over to his powerful ex-wife. I left my corporate headquarters as the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the financial district. I went home and changed into a sharp, sophisticated, emerald green dress. I did not pack a single dollar bill into the leather briefcase I carried. Instead, I filled it with the devastating medical and financial dossiers my team had compiled proving her affair with the chief financial officer. When my private driver pulled up to Le Petit Chateau, the memories of my proposal night rushed back. I remembered Bradley ordering an expensive bottle of champagne he could not genuinely afford, making grand sweeping promises about our future together. I had been so blindly in love back then, so willing to believe in his potential. Now I was walking through those same heavy oak doors, not as a naive girl, but as the architect of his absolute ruin. The maitre d' recognized me instantly, owing to the generous influence of Apex Holdings. He escorted me to the premium corner booth draped in heavy crimson velvet. It was the exact same table where Bradley had slipped a ring onto my finger. I set the heavy leather briefcase on the pristine white tablecloth and ordered a glass of vintage red wine. I sat back against the plush velvet listening to the soft, elegant notes of the string quartet playing in the background. The trap was perfectly set, and the bait was on its way. Exactly at 8 o'clock, the heavy oak doors of Le Petit Chateau opened. Vanessa walked in. She looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, entitled woman who had marched into my dining room just a few days ago demanding I pack my bags. The sharp, confident mistress had been completely replaced by a frantic, terrified fugitive. She was wearing a cheap, beige trench coat pulled tightly around her body and oversized sunglasses that looked ridiculous in the dimly lit restaurant. She kept glancing nervously over her shoulder like a hunted animal waiting for a predator to strike. The maitre d' looked her up and down with clear professional distaste. He was accustomed to seating the city's most elite executives, not disheveled, panicked women carrying oversized stolen designer handbags. I caught his eye and gave a subtle nod. Recognizing me, he maintained his flawless composure and guided Vanessa silently through the maze of perfectly set tables toward my secluded corner booth. Vanessa slid into the crimson velvet seat opposite me. The plush cushions seemed to swallow her small, trembling frame. She was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling in rapid, erratic bursts. She dropped her heavy luxury bag onto the pristine white tablecloth, ignoring the quiet elegance of the string quartet, playing a soft, methodical classical piece in the background. "Do you have the cash?" she demanded, skipping any pretense of a polite greeting. Her eyes darted straight to the sleek leather briefcase resting securely under my hands. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my vintage red wine. I enjoyed watching her squirm in the very same booth where Bradley had once promised me a lifetime of loyalty. "You look terrible, Vanessa," I observed, keeping my voice perfectly level. "The stress of being a federal fugitive does not suit you." "I do not have time for your insults, Chelsea," she snapped, leaning across the table and lowering her voice to a harsh whisper. "I have a flight booked out of the country that boards in 3 hours. I need that money right now. Hand over the briefcase." I tapped my manicured fingernails against the cool leather handle of the briefcase. "Let us see the merchandise first," I told her. "I am not in the habit of paying a premium for empty promises. Show me the drive." She dug frantically into her oversized purse. Her hands were shaking so violently that a tube of expensive lipstick fell out and rolled across the polished hardwood floor. She completely ignored it, pulling out a sleek silver hard drive. She gripped it tightly, as if it were a physical lifeline. "This is it," she whispered, her voice tight with absolute panic. "Every single hidden offshore account, every fake invoice he used to steal from his investors, the shell companies he set up to funnel the runway funds. It is enough financial evidence to put him away for 20 years. Now give me the cash so I can leave. I did my part of the deal." I reached out and took the hard drive from her trembling fingers. I felt its cool metallic weight. It was incredibly small, but it contained the absolute destruction of a man who truly thought he was an untouchable god. I placed the silver drive neatly on the white tablecloth right next to my wineglass, perfectly illuminated by the soft candlelight. I glanced at the vintage gold clock mounted on the far wall of the elegant dining room. It was exactly 8:14. I rested my hands back on the leather briefcase. "You are cutting it awfully close, Vanessa," I said, leaning back against the crimson velvet. "Are you absolutely sure Bradley does not know you took his most prized possession?" "He has no idea," she scoffed, a brief, pathetic flash of her old arrogance returning to her pale face. "He is too busy screaming at his useless lawyers in that filthy motel room. He thinks I am in the bathroom taking a long shower. He is completely clueless, Chelsea. He actually thinks I'm going to stick around and raise a baby in a federal prison waiting room. I am smarter than him." I smiled, letting the silence stretch out. 8:15. The heavy oak front doors of Le Petit Chateau swung open with a forceful, aggressive push. The cool evening air rushed into the warm, sophisticated dining room. I looked past Vanessa's shoulder and watched Bradley stride into the elegant establishment. He looked absolutely unhinged. He was still wearing the exact same wrinkled suit trousers from the cheap motel, but he had thrown a dark jacket over his rumpled shirt. He was clutching his cell phone tightly in his hand, his bloodshot eyes wildly scanning the dimly lit restaurant. He was desperately searching for the anonymous informant who had promised him the identity of the person who had ruined his company. Vanessa had her back to the entrance. She was entirely focused on the leather briefcase sitting between us, completely unaware of the doom approaching from behind. "Just open the latch, Chelsea," she begged, leaning further over the table. "Give me the money so I can leave. I gave you the weapon to destroy him." I took another slow sip of my red wine, maintaining unbroken eye contact with her. "I do not think you are going anywhere tonight, Vanessa." Bradley marched past the maitre d', completely ignoring the man's polite protests about the strict restaurant dress code. He moved aggressively through the maze of white-clothed tables, his head turning sharply as he inspected the faces of the wealthy diners. Then his frantic gaze locked onto the secluded corner booth. He saw my emerald green dress. He saw my relaxed, powerful posture. And then his eyes fell upon the woman sitting directly across from me. I watched the exact second the catastrophic realization hit him. He stopped dead in his tracks, right in the middle of the upscale dining room. He saw Vanessa. He saw the silver hard drive resting conspicuously on the pristine white tablecloth, right next to my wine glass. It was his personal backup drive, the one he guarded with his very life. The remaining blood drained from his face, leaving him a sickly grayish white. The man who thought he could outsmart federal regulators and billionaire investors had just been outplayed by the two women he thought he completely controlled. His mind struggled to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. The devoted mistress he had sacrificed his entire marriage for, the woman carrying his supposed heir, was actively selling him out to the powerful ex-wife he had tried to destroy. Vanessa finally noticed that my gaze was fixed on something standing directly behind her. A cold shiver must have run down her spine because she slowly turned her head. When she saw Bradley standing just 10 feet away, staring at her with pure murderous rage, she let out a strangled, terrified gasp. The color vanished from her cheeks. She pressed herself hard against the velvet booth, looking exactly like a trapped animal. Bradley did not care about the elegant atmosphere. He did not care about the wealthy patrons watching him. He closed the remaining distance in 3 long, aggressive strides. He slammed both of his hands down flat onto our table, making the expensive crystal glasses jump and rattle violently against the porcelain plates. "What the hell is going on here?" Bradley seethed, his voice a dark, dangerous whisper that carried heavily over the soft classical music. I did not flinch when his hands slammed against the pristine white tablecloth. The vintage red wine rippled in my glass, but I kept my posture perfectly relaxed, leaning back against the crimson velvet booth. Bradley was breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically between my calm face and the terrified expression of his fleeing mistress. He looked down at the silver hard drive resting right next to my drink. The realization of what that small device contained seemed to short-circuit his brain. "Vanessa, what is that doing here?" Bradley demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and absolute panic. Tell me you did not take my backup drive. Tell me you are not selling me out to her. Vanessa pressed herself so hard against the back of the booth she looked like she was trying to merge with the upholstery. She could not formulate a single coherent word. Her mouth opened and closed in silent terror as she clutched her stolen designer handbag to her chest. She looked from Bradley to the leather briefcase sitting securely under my hands, desperately hoping I would somehow intervene and hand over her escape money. I did not reach for the cash. Instead, I popped the brass latches on the leather briefcase with 2 sharp clicks. Bradley and Vanessa both jumped at the sound. Vanessa leaned forward, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation, expecting to see neat stacks of untraceable bills. Bradley watched with sickening dread, completely convinced I was about to pay for his total destruction. I opened the lid and reached inside. I did not pull out a single dollar bill. I withdrew a thick, securely bound dossier and let the briefcase fall shut. I slid the heavy file across the smooth white tablecloth, stopping it right in front of Bradley's shaking hands. "You wanted to know what is going on here, Bradley," I said, keeping my voice perfectly composed and authoritative. "I am simply closing out my final audit. I brought you a gift for our anniversary. It is the absolute truth. You might want to open it before the federal agents find you." Bradley stared at the dossier as if it were a live explosive. His hand shook violently as he reached out and flipped open the heavy cover. Vanessa let out a strange, panicked whimpering sound. She knew what kind of financial resources I possessed, but she had no idea just how deep my investigative team had dug into her personal life. Bradley scanned the first page and his bloodshot eyes widened in sheer confusion. "These are bank statements," he muttered, looking up at me. "These are not my accounts. This is the chief financial officer's personal offshore account." "Why are you showing me this, Chelsea?" "Keep reading," I instructed, watching the arrogant tech executive completely unravel. "Look at the wire transfers, Bradley. Look at the exact dates and the routing numbers." He flipped the page, his breathing becoming more erratic by the second. He traced the lines of financial data with a trembling finger. He saw massive sums of money being siphoned directly from his startup accounts, not just into his own illicit shell companies, but secretly funneled straight into the private accounts of his trusted chief financial officer. Then he saw the secondary transfers, hundreds of thousands of dollars moving from the chief financial officer's hidden accounts directly into a private trust fund registered entirely in Vanessa's name. "What is this?" Bradley whispered, his voice cracking. "Why is my chief financial officer sending Vanessa hundreds of thousands of dollars?" Vanessa let out a loud dramatic sob, covering her face with her hands. She tried to slide out of the velvet booth to make a run for the front doors, but Bradley immediately reached across the table and grabbed her wrist, pinning her in place. He was not letting her escape until he understood the absolute magnitude of her betrayal. "Turn to the third page, Bradley," I said, taking another slow sip of my red wine. "The financial fraud is just the beginning. The medical records are much more interesting." Bradley yanked the next page over. It was a highly detailed medical dossier obtained through my elite private investigators. It contained ultrasound appointments, prenatal care bills, and a definitive non-invasive prenatal paternity test. Bradley stared at the bold black letters printed across the top of the medical report. His face went from pale gray to a sickening shade of green. He read the results once, twice, and then a third time, his brain violently rejecting the information printed on the page. "The baby is not mine," Bradley choked out, his voice sounding entirely hollow and broken. "No, Bradley, it is not," I confirmed, delivering the final lethal blow to his massive, fragile ego. "The heir you were so incredibly proud of, the child you demanded I make room for in my own home, belongs to your chief financial officer. You have been playing the role of the generous billionaire while the two of them played you for an absolute fool." Vanessa was crying hysterically now, sobbing about how it was a mistake and how the chief financial officer had manipulated her. But the paperwork told the undeniable truth. "They set you up, Bradley," I explained, watching his entire world collapse into dust. "Your chief financial officer needed a rich, arrogant fall guy to take the blame for the missing millions. He knew you were desperate for validation and extremely easy to manipulate. He used Vanessa to keep you distracted and compliant. She fed your ego, she pretended to worship your visionary genius, and she isolated you from anyone who might actually warn you. All while the two of them quietly drained your company dry. When the federal authorities inevitably came knocking, you were going to be the only one holding the bag. You were going to take the fall for the wire fraud, the embezzlement, and the fabricated user metrics, while they planned to disappear with the cash. Bradley slowly lifted his head from the dossier. He looked at Vanessa, the young, vibrant assistant he thought worshipped the ground he walked on. He saw her now for exactly what she was: a ruthless, opportunistic parasite who had actively participated in his total destruction. The illusion of his powerful executive lifestyle completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but the cold, hard reality of his impending federal prison sentence. He realized he had thrown away his marriage, his home, and his entire future for a woman who was actively helping another man steal his freedom. He had marched into my lobby trying to humiliate me, completely unaware that he was the biggest joke in the entire financial district. "You set me up," Bradley whispered, staring at Vanessa with a dark, terrifying intensity. "You let me buy you diamonds and cars while you were carrying his baby. You were going to let me rot in a concrete cell." I just watched him process the absolute magnitude of his own stupidity. I had not paid a single dime for this revelation. I had simply connected the dots and laid them out on a table at the exact restaurant where he had once promised to protect me. I sat back against the plush crimson velvet, completely untouchable, watching the fallout of his catastrophic choices unfold right in front of me. Bradley stood there, paralyzed by the sheer weight of his own profound stupidity. The silence at our corner booth was deafening, sharply contrasting with the gentle, sophisticated melody of the string quartet playing nearby. I watched the exact second his brain stopped trying to rationalize the medical and financial documents I had placed before him. The denial completely evaporated, leaving nothing behind but raw, unadulterated fury. The veins in his neck bulged, pulsing rapidly against the collar of his wrinkled shirt. His jaw clenched so tightly I could actually hear his teeth grinding together. Vanessa desperately tried to backpedal. She pressed herself against the velvet cushions, raising her trembling hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Bradley, please," she whimpered, her voice cracking in pure terror. "You have to understand. I was scared. The chief financial officer threatened me. He told me if I did not distract you, he would ruin my career. I never wanted to hurt you. I love you." It was the worst possible lie she could have ever told. The direct mention of the chief financial officer, the very man who had planted his child in her womb and used Bradley as a human shield for federal fraud, was the absolute breaking point. Bradley let out a guttural, terrifying roar that sounded entirely inhuman. He lunged violently across the wide table. He did not care about the sophisticated, high-end environment. He did not care about the wealthy, influential diners sitting just a few feet away. He completely abandoned any remaining shred of his polished corporate persona, giving into absolute blind rage. His large hands aggressively grabbed the collar of Vanessa's cheap beige trench coat. The sheer force of his sudden movement caught the edge of the pristine white tablecloth. As he yanked Vanessa forward, he dragged the heavy fabric right along with him. The entire table setting was instantly decimated. My half-full glass of vintage red wine tipped over, spilling dark crimson liquid across the stark white linen like fresh blood. Crystal water goblets crashed onto the polished hardwood floor, shattering into hundreds of jagged, glittering fragments. Expensive porcelain plates cracked loudly against the heavy mahogany table base, sending food flying across the aisle. The elegant, refined atmosphere of Le Petit Chateau was instantly and completely obliterated. The string quartet stopped playing with a harsh, discordant screech of a violin bow. Wealthy patrons at the surrounding tables leaped out of their luxury chairs in absolute horror. Women gasped and shielded their faces from the flying shards of crystal, while several men immediately pulled out their cell phones to dial emergency services. I did not move a single muscle. I remained perfectly seated against the plush crimson velvet of my booth, entirely untouched by the violent destruction unfolding mere inches away from me. I simply lifted my feet slightly to avoid the pooling red wine and watched the man who had arrogantly demanded I pack my bags act like a rabid feral animal. There was profound poetic justice in watching his life violently implode in the exact same restaurant where he had proposed to me 5 years ago. Bradley had Vanessa pinned against the edge of the heavy wooden table, screaming directly into her terrified face. "You used me!" he roared, his voice cracking with pure, unrestrained madness. "You let me throw away my marriage. You let me buy you a sports car with stolen money. You told me that baby was my heir. You are a disgusting, lying parasite. I am going to destroy you and that bastard chief financial officer." Vanessa shrieked, kicking her legs wildly, her designer heels slipping desperately against the wet, wine-soaked floorboards. She flailed her arms, striking Bradley uselessly in the chest, sobbing and begging for someone to help her. Her oversized designer sunglasses were knocked from her face, falling to the floor, where they were instantly crushed beneath Bradley's heavy shoes. The restaurant staff did not hesitate. The maitre d', abandoning his composed demeanor, sprinted across the dining room, shouting urgent commands. 3 large, broad-shouldered restaurant security guards in tailored dark suits rushed the corner booth with the speed and efficiency of highly trained professionals. They grabbed Bradley by the shoulders of his wrinkled jacket, forcefully attempting to pry his rigid fingers off Vanessa's throat. Bradley thrashed violently, completely blinded by his humiliated rage. He threw his elbow backward, catching one of the guards in the chest, refusing to let go of the woman who had helped orchestrate his total ruin. "Get your hands off me!" Bradley screamed, spitting his words as the guards wrestled him backward. "Do you know who I am? I am a chief executive officer. She stole from me. She ruined my life." "Sir, you need to calm down immediately, or we will use extreme physical force," the head security guard warned, wrapping a thick, muscular arm around Bradley's neck in a strict restraint hold. Together, the 3 men managed to physically drag the thrashing, raving tech founder away from the table, pinning his arms sharply behind his back. Vanessa collapsed onto the floor amidst the broken crystal and spilled wine. She was hyperventilating, clutching her throat and sobbing uncontrollably. She frantically grabbed her stolen luxury handbag, pulling it tightly against her chest, as if the expensive leather could somehow protect her from the catastrophic reality of her situation. She looked up at me from the ruined floor, her mascara completely running down her pale cheeks, her eyes wide with a pathetic unspoken plea for mercy. I offered her absolutely none. I looked down at her shivering, pathetic form with profound, chilling indifference. The grand, arrogant future she had bragged about in my dining room had officially evaporated into thin air. Bradley was still struggling against the security guards, his face a violent shade of purple. He turned his wild, desperate eyes toward me, breathing heavily. "Chelsea, tell them to let me go," he pleaded, his voice shifting rapidly from aggressive rage to pathetic begging. "You have to help me. You have to explain to them." She set me up. I did not know about the fraud. I was manipulated. "You have to save me." He genuinely thought that after everything he had done, I would still step in and act as his savior. He expected the quiet, obedient wife he had tried to discard to rise from the velvet booth and rescue him from his own spectacular self-destruction. I simply smoothed the pristine fabric of my emerald green dress, my expression completely unbothered. "I am not your wife anymore, Bradley," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the chaotic, noisy dining room. "I am the person who exposed your fraud to the entire financial district. I am not here to save you. I am here to watch you burn." The sheer coldness of my response seemed to finally break the last remaining thread of his sanity. He let out a loud, despairing wail, sagging heavily against the firm grip of the security guards, completely defeated. The chaos inside the upscale restaurant had reached its absolute peak. Diners were murmuring in shock, staff were securing the perimeter, and Bradley was sobbing uncontrollably in the arms of the restraint team. And then, cutting straight through the heavy, panicked atmosphere, the front glass doors of Le Petit Chateau swung wide open once again. The heavy glass doors of Le Petit Chateau swung open with such tremendous force that they hit the brass stoppers with a loud, resonant crack. The chilly night air swept into the warm, sophisticated dining room, disturbing the flickering candles on the remaining upright tables. I remained perfectly still in my velvet booth, watching the magnificent finale of my meticulously designed trap unfold. Jamal strode through the grand entrance. My 36-year-old brother-in-law looked like the absolute embodiment of justice. The tall, brilliant African-American corporate attorney wore a razor-sharp charcoal suit, carrying his signature heavy leather briefcase. His posture was incredibly rigid, and his expression was carved from pure stone. He exuded a level of unyielding authority that completely dwarfed the pathetic thrashing man currently being held back by the restaurant security guards. But Jamal had not come to this high-end restaurant alone. Stepping in directly behind him, moving with intense tactical precision, were two federal agents, wearing dark protective windbreakers with bright yellow letters printed boldly across their backs. Following closely behind the federal agents was a team of specialized corporate fraud investigators dressed in sharp business attire, carrying thick official folders. They fanned out immediately, securing the front entrance and stepping decisively into the dining room. The remaining wealthy patrons gasped, backing away from the chaotic scene. The restaurant manager scrambled forward frantically, trying to assess the situation, but one of the federal agents held up an official badge, silencing any protest before they could even begin. Bradley stopped struggling against the restaurant security team, his bloodshot eyes locked onto Jamal. For a fleeting, delusional second, a look of profound relief washed over his sweaty, bruised face. He genuinely thought his sister's husband had rushed down here to offer high-level legal counsel to save him from this massive public misunderstanding. "Jamal, thank God you are here," Bradley gasped out, his voice hoarse and desperate. "Tell these rent-a-cops to let me go. You have to represent me. Chelsea and Vanessa set me up. You have to sue them for defamation and assault right now." Jamal did not rush forward to help. He stopped a few feet away from the ruined corner booth, looking down at Bradley with absolute professional disgust. He slowly adjusted his glasses, staring at the man who had hurled vile, racist, and classist insults at him just a few days ago at the pitching gala. "I am not here to represent you, Bradley," Jamal said, his deep voice carrying clearly across the silent dining room. "I am here representing the defrauded investors of your company." Bradley blinked, his brain completely failing to process the words. "What are you talking about? You are my family." "You burned those bridges the moment you decided to operate a criminal enterprise," Jamal replied coldly. "A few hours ago, I received an encrypted digital package containing an exact mirror copy of your genuine financial ledgers. I reviewed the unencrypted hard drive. I saw the hidden offshore accounts. I saw the fabricated user metrics. I saw the deliberate, massive misuse of venture capital runway funds. As an officer of the court and a man of strict legal integrity, I had a moral and professional obligation to immediately process that evidence and hand it over to the proper federal authorities." I took a slow sip of my red wine, thoroughly enjoying the absolute perfection of the moment. I had indeed sent an anonymous, heavily encrypted copy of the stolen hard drive directly to Jamal's private server before I ever left my office. I knew his profound sense of justice would compel him to act swiftly and decisively. He was the perfect weapon to deliver the final killing blow. "You sold me out!" Bradley shrieked, spitting the words out as he thrashed wildly against the security guards again. "You arrogant traitor, I will destroy you." Jamal simply stepped aside, gesturing for the federal agents to take over. The two FBI agents closed the distance in a matter of seconds. They bypassed the restaurant security team and grabbed Bradley by the shoulders, spinning him around with forceful, overwhelming authority. Bradley let out a loud, panicked yelp as one of the agents slammed him face first right onto the nearest empty dining table. The impact rattled the fine china and silverware loudly. "Bradley, you are under arrest," the lead agent announced, retrieving a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The sharp clicking sound of the metal ratchets locking tightly around Bradley's wrists echoed sharply through the quiet restaurant. "You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and aggravated assault." "I did not do it," Bradley sobbed, his face pressed hard against the pristine white tablecloth. He was crying like a terrified child, all his arrogant bravado entirely stripped away. "It was my chief financial officer. He set me up. He got Vanessa pregnant. You have to arrest them. You have to believe me. You will have plenty of time to tell your fabricated stories to a federal judge." the second agent stated firmly, hauling Bradley back up to his feet by his bound arms. Vanessa remained huddled on the floor, covered in spilled wine and broken crystal, shaking uncontrollably as a corporate investigator knelt beside her to begin questioning her direct involvement. She looked up at Bradley as he was roughly pulled away, her eyes wide with total unadulterated horror. As the federal agents marched my sobbing, ruined ex-husband toward the front exit, I shifted my gaze past the dramatic scene in the dining room. I looked through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that made up the front wall of Le Petit Chateau. The city streets outside were illuminated by the harsh, flashing red and blue lights of the federal cruisers parked at the curb. Standing right on the edge of the wet pavement, illuminated by the aggressive strobe of the police lights, were two incredibly pathetic figures. It was Brenda and Richard. They looked absolutely wretched. Following the aggressive foreclosure of their home and the total freezing of their bank accounts earlier that afternoon, they had been rendered completely homeless. They had been wandering the city streets, desperately searching for their golden boy, hoping he could somehow perform a miracle and save them from absolute poverty. They had tracked him down to this restaurant, expecting to find a wealthy tech chief executive officer holding court. Instead, they pressed their hands against the cold, damp glass of the restaurant windows, watching their entire future collapse. Brenda's face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated agony. Her mouth was open in a silent, screaming wail as she watched the federal agents drag her handcuffed, crying son right past the maitre d's stand. Richard stood frozen beside her, his shoulders slumped in total defeat, tears streaming down his weathered face. They had sacrificed their entire retirement fund, their home and their dignity for a man who was now being shoved into the back of a secure federal transport vehicle. Through the thick glass window, Brenda locked eyes with me. She was standing out in the cold, shivering and homeless, completely stripped of her pretentious pride. I sat comfortably in the warm, luxurious booth, raising my glass of vintage red wine in a silent, mocking toast to her profound failure. I watched the heavy doors of the federal cruiser slam shut, trapping Bradley inside. The flashing lights pulled away into the dark city night, leaving his parents sobbing, broken and entirely alone on the pavement. 8 months later, the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut, sealing Bradley inside a reality he could no longer manipulate. I sat in the polished wooden gallery, not as a victim, but as a quiet observer of absolute justice. The courtroom was vast and intimidating, a stark contrast to the flashy tech galas Bradley used to dominate. He sat at the defense table wearing an oversized, ill-fitting prison-issue jumpsuit that hung off his shrinking frame. The arrogant chief executive officer was entirely gone, replaced by a trembling, hollow shell of a man. Standing at the prosecutor's podium was Jamal. My brilliant brother-in-law commanded the room with an unparalleled presence. As an African-American corporate attorney who had built his reputation on unwavering integrity, Jamal was methodical, ruthless, and completely flawless in his delivery. He represented the defrauded investors, laying out the complicated web of wire fraud, embezzlement, and fabricated user metrics with surgical precision. He presented the financial ledgers, the offshore account routing numbers, and the exact timeline of Bradley's massive corporate theft. Jamal did not just present a legal case. He dismantled Bradley's entire existence piece by piece, leaving the defense attorneys with absolutely no room to argue reasonable doubt. Bradley had desperately tried to throw the blame onto his chief financial officer, but he was outplayed there too. The chief financial officer, a true corporate shark, saw the federal indictments coming and immediately cut a highly lucrative plea deal. He handed over every single encrypted email and secret server password to the authorities, securing his own reduced sentence while throwing Bradley squarely under the bus. Bradley was left holding the bag for millions of dollars in stolen venture capital, just as I had warned him. The federal judge, a no-nonsense woman with zero tolerance for corporate greed, struck her gavel with a resounding crack. She sentenced Bradley to 7 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. I watched Bradley's shoulders violently heave as he began to sob uncontrollably, right there in open court. The heavy steel chains around his waist and wrists rattled loudly as federal marshals pulled him to his feet and escorted him out of the courtroom through a secure side door. The fallout of that aggressive plea deal extended far beyond the courtroom walls. When the chief financial officer secured his own safety, he completely severed all ties with Vanessa. He abandoned his pregnant mistress the very second she became a financial liability, cutting off her access to the hidden trust funds and permanently blocking her number. Vanessa was left entirely alone, drowning in a massive ocean of legal debt and frozen bank accounts. The federal government had swept in and seized the sports car, the designer handbags, and the heavy gold jewelry Bradley had bought her with stolen funds. I recently received a detailed update from my private investigators regarding her current situation. Vanessa gave birth to the chief financial officer's child in a chaotic, underfunded county hospital, completely devoid of the luxury and pampering she had aggressively demanded in my dining room. Today, she works double shifts at a greasy, rundown diner on the outskirts of the city. The woman who had once paraded around high society events, declaring herself a future chief executive officer's wife, now spends her days wiping spilled ketchup off sticky laminated tables. She wears a cheap stained uniform, her youthful arrogance entirely erased by the crushing weight of single motherhood and minimum wage survival. Her designer heels have been permanently replaced by cheap non-slip work shoes, and her grand illusions of multi-million-dollar wealth have evaporated into the smell of stale fryer grease. But perhaps the most profound poetic justice fell upon Brenda and Richard. My former in-laws had staked their entire existence on their son's imaginary empire, sacrificing their home and their retirement to maintain their desperate illusion of upper-class status. Following the aggressive foreclosure of their beautiful suburban house, they had nowhere left to turn. The wealthy social circles they had fought so hard to infiltrate immediately shunned them, pretending they had never even met. My security team provided me with a final background report on their whereabouts. Brenda and Richard currently reside in a bleak, decaying trailer park located right next to a noisy industrial highway. The couple who had once marched into my high-end corporate lobby wearing faux pearls and demanding my eviction now live in a cramped, rusting metal box with peeling paint and a leaking roof. They were forced to pack their few remaining unsellable belongings into cheap black garbage bags, loading them into the back of a borrowed pickup truck. Richard spends his days sitting on a broken plastic lawn chair, staring blankly at the highway traffic, entirely broken by his spectacular failure. Brenda, the woman who loved to publicly shame others for their clothing and their careers, now stands in long lines at the local grocery store, nervously counting out government-issued food stamps just to afford basic canned goods. The deep, suffocating shame of their new reality has aged them both by 20 years. They lost their son, they lost their money, and they permanently lost the fake aristocratic pride that had fueled their toxic, miserable lives. I walked out of the federal courthouse that afternoon feeling the bright, warm sun on my face. The air tasted incredibly sweet. The massive toxic storm that Bradley and his family had brought into my life was officially over. They had been entirely swept away by their own greed, leaving me standing perfectly untouched on the shore. A few weeks after the sentencing, the dust had finally settled completely. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the Apex Holdings executive boardroom, looking out over the sprawling financial district. The city looked different to me now. It was no longer a battleground where I had to hide my true identity to protect a fragile, arrogant man. It was simply my domain. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom opened, breaking the absolute silence. Jamal walked in. My former brother-in-law looked entirely different from the stressed, cautious man who had stood in my corporate lobby months ago. He looked lighter, sharper, and completely unburdened. Jamal had faced his own brutal reckoning during the trial. When he chose to represent the defrauded investors and actively prosecute his own brother-in-law, the toxic family dynamic violently turned on him. Megan Bradley's sister and Jamal's now ex-wife had shown her true colors. She inherited the exact same manipulative entitlement that plagued Brenda and Richard. She had screamed at Jamal, demanding he drop the federal case, threatening to take his children away if he ruined her brother's life. But Jamal was a man of uncompromising integrity. He did not bow to her emotional terrorism. Instead, he filed for divorce the very next morning. Using his brilliant legal mind and his meticulous documentation skills, Jamal had completely outmaneuvered Megan in family court. He exposed her toxic behavior, her financial instability, and the severe emotional manipulation she subjected their children to. The family court judge did not hesitate. Jamal secured full and absolute custody of his kids, permanently removing them from the poisonous influence of his former in-laws. I turned away from the skyline and walked over to the expansive glass conference table. I gestured for Jamal to take a seat opposite me. He set his heavy leather briefcase on the floor and sat down, projecting the calm professional authority I had always respected. "It is good to see you, Chelsea," Jamal said, his deep voice echoing slightly in the large room. "I wanted to thank you again for the encrypted hard drive. It made the prosecution seamless. It saved the investors years of litigation." "You did the hard work," Jamal, I replied, taking the seat at the head of the table. "You stood up against your own family to do what was legally and morally right. You sacrificed your marriage to protect innocent people from financial ruin. That requires a level of character that is exceptionally rare in this industry." Jamal offered a small, modest smile. "I just removed a cancer from my life. Megan was exactly like Bradley. I just refused to see it until they tried to make me an accomplice to federal fraud. My children deserve a safe, stable environment, and I intend to give them one." I nodded, leaning forward, resting my hands on the cool glass. "That is exactly why I asked you to come here today. Apex Holdings is entering a massive period of expansion. We are launching several new investment branches, and our portfolio is growing exponentially. With that growth comes an intense need for rigorous legal oversight. We need someone who cannot be bought. We need someone who cannot be manipulated by flashy pitches or emotional extortion." Jamal listened intently, his sharp eyes locked onto mine. "I am formally offering you the position of Chief Legal Counsel at Apex Holdings," I announced, keeping my tone entirely professional, but laced with profound respect. "You will oversee all final investment contracts, manage our corporate compliance team, and lead the due diligence operations for every major funding round. You will have full executive authority." Jamal sat back in his chair, momentarily stunned. He was a highly successful lawyer, but chief legal counsel at a venture capital giant like Apex Holdings was a pinnacle career achievement. It was the kind of position that granted immense industry power and undeniable prestige. "Chelsea," he started, his voice careful. "You know my connection to Bradley. You know the circus my former in-laws dragged me into. Are you absolutely certain you want me embedded in your executive team?" I smiled, feeling a deep sense of absolute certainty. "Your connection to Bradley is exactly why I know I can trust you. When you saw the fraud, you did not hesitate to destroy him. You chose justice over a toxic bloodline. You chose ethics over a comfortable lie. I do not care about the circus, Jamal. I care about the man who walked into that high-end restaurant with federal agents and put a stop to the madness." Jamal looked around the magnificent boardroom, taking in the sleek, modern design and the sheer magnitude of the empire I had built from the ground up. He looked back at me, the last remaining traces of his past family trauma melting away completely. He saw what I saw. We were two people who had survived the exact same storm, who had both been targeted by the exact same manipulative parasites, and who had both emerged completely victorious because we refused to compromise our morals. He stood up from his chair, buttoning his tailored suit jacket with a renewed sense of absolute purpose. He walked to the head of the glass table and extended his right hand. "I accept the position," Chairwoman Jamal said, his voice carrying a powerful, resonant strength. "I look forward to protecting this firm with everything I have." I stood up and firmly shook his hand. The grip was solid, sealing a powerful, respectful alliance built entirely on mutual integrity and truth. We had officially replaced the miserable, toxic ties of our past with chosen, loyal allies. We were moving forward into the future, and there was absolutely no one left who could drag us down. With my executive team fully solidified, and Jamal taking the helm of our legal compliance, there was only one final loose end left to sever. The divorce proceedings had moved swiftly through the courts in Bradley's absence, but there was one last piece of documentation requiring his physical signature to completely separate our financial histories. My attorneys offered to handle the prison visit on my behalf. I politely declined. I wanted to look him in the eye one last time. The federal penitentiary was a bleak, imposing fortress of gray concrete and coiled razor wire. It stood in stark, absolute contrast to the glittering corporate ballrooms Bradley used to obsess over. I walked through the heavy security checkpoints wearing a pristine white tailored suit, my heels clicking sharply against the sterile linoleum floors. I was escorted into a small, dreary visitation room, divided by a thick pane of reinforced glass. I sat down in the rigid metal chair, placing the final legal document and a cheap plastic pen on the counter. A heavy steel door on the opposite side of the room buzzed open. Two armed guards escorted Bradley into the visitor booth. The sight of him was genuinely jarring. The arrogant, flashy tech founder who used to strut around high-end restaurants barking orders at waiters was completely gone. In his place stood a gaunt, hollowed-out shell of a man. His skin had taken on a sickly gray pallor, and he had lost a significant amount of weight, causing his oversized prison-issue jumpsuit to hang limply off his frame. His hair, once styled with expensive salon products, was now buzzed close to his scalp. He looked small, weak, and utterly defeated. He sat down heavily in the chair across from me, picking up the plastic telephone receiver with trembling hands. I picked up my receiver, holding it steady. "Chelsea," he breathed out, his voice cracking instantly. "You came. You actually came." I slid the final property release document through the narrow metal slot under the glass. "I did not come for a social visit, Bradley," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Sign the paper. It officially relinquishes any residual claim to the suburban house you tried to leverage. Once you sign this, our legal ties are permanently dissolved." He looked down at the document but made no move to pick up the pen. Instead, his bloodshot eyes locked onto mine, and they quickly filled with desperate, pooling tears. He pressed his free hand against the reinforced glass, his fingers shaking against the smudge-proof surface. "Please, Chelsea," he begged, tears spilling over his pale cheeks. "Do not do this. Do not leave me here like this. I have lost absolutely everything. My company is gone. My parents will not even accept my calls anymore. I have nothing left but you." I looked at him, feeling a profound sense of nothingness. There was no anger left, no betrayal, no lingering hurt. He was just a pathetic consequence of his own terrible choices. "You have nothing left because you destroyed it all, Bradley," I replied coldly. "I told you to sign the paper." "I was stupid," he sobbed heavily, his shoulders heaving under the orange fabric. "It was just a temporary lapse in judgment. I let the stress of the startup get to my head. Vanessa meant absolutely nothing to me. She tricked me. She manipulated my ego. I was blind, but I see everything clearly now. I still love you, Chelsea. I have always loved you. I am a changed man. Just wait for me. When I get out, we can start over. We can rebuild." He was still trying to sell a vision. Even now, sitting in a federal prison serving a 7-year sentence for massive corporate fraud, he was desperately trying to pitch me a fake future. He honestly believed he could charm his way out of the absolute devastation he had orchestrated. I looked at his desperate, tear-stained face, and a slow, warm smile spread across my own. I did not yell at him. I did not list his failures or remind him of the cruel insults he had hurled at me in my own dining room. I simply reached over with my right hand and grasped the edge of the diamond wedding ring I had left on my finger specifically for this exact moment. I pulled the heavy diamond band off my finger. The metal felt instantly foreign, separated from my skin. Bradley stopped crying, his eyes widening as he watched my hand. "Your temporary lapse in judgment was the best gift I ever received, Bradley," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, absolute authority through the telephone receiver. "It showed me exactly who you are, and it freed me to become exactly who I was meant to be." I stood up from the metal chair. I did not hand the ring to a guard. I did not put it in my pocket to sell later. I walked over to the cheap aluminum trash can, resting in the corner of the visitation room. I held the diamond ring over the open bin and let it drop. It hit the bottom of the empty metal can with a sharp, definitive clatter that echoed loudly in the small room. No, Bradley shrieked, slamming his hands against the thick glass. Chelsea, please, you cannot just walk away. I hung the telephone receiver back on the wall hook, cutting off his voice entirely. I turned my back on the glass booth and walked toward the exit. Behind me, I could hear the muffled, frantic sounds of Bradley screaming my name, pounding his fists against the reinforced pane as the prison guards moved in to forcefully restrain him. I did not look back, not even for a second. I walked out of the federal penitentiary and into the bright, warm afternoon sun. My private chauffeur was waiting beside a sleek black car, holding the rear door open for me. I slid into the luxurious leather seat and gave a single nod. The car pulled away from the bleak concrete prison, leaving my past permanently behind. 30 minutes later, the car smoothly pulled onto the private aviation tarmac. A pristine white private jet was fueled and waiting, its engines humming with quiet power. I walked up the boarding stairs and settled into the plush cabin, securing my seatbelt as the pilot prepared for immediate takeoff. My executive assistant handed me a tablet displaying the finalized press release for tomorrow morning. We were heading straight to Silicon Valley. Apex Holdings was officially launching a massive new venture capital branch. This specific fund was endowed with $100 million, entirely dedicated to funding and empowering female founders who had successfully escaped financial and emotional abuse. We were going to provide the capital, the legal protection, and the corporate backing they needed to build their own empires without ever having to answer to manipulative men. The private jet accelerated down the runway, lifting smoothly into the air. I looked out the oval window as the ground dropped away beneath me. The sky outside was bright, clear, and brilliantly blue, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. It was the absolute embodiment of pure, limitless freedom and undeniable power. I closed my eyes, leaning back into my seat, and smiled, knowing my greatest chapter was only just beginning. The greatest lesson I learned is that true power does not come from blind vengeance. It comes from reclaiming your self-worth and refusing to be a victim of toxic manipulation. My ex-husband thought he could use financial abuse to break me, but his betrayal became the exact catalyst I needed to secure my absolute freedom. We cannot control the arrogance of others, but we have complete authority over how we rebuild our lives. Never let a manipulative partner convince you that you are weak. Take back your power today and build a future they can only dream of. Please share your own stories of overcoming toxic relationships in the comments below.